Welcome back to Park Ranger Files. Tonight's accounts all come from small towns in the Appalachians, written by the people who lived there or grew up there and had something happen that they couldn't set down. Story 1. I want to start by telling you what Canaan, West Virginia is, because people who haven't been there tend to have a wrong picture of small West Virginia towns, and this account doesn't make sense without the right one. Canaan Valley is up in Tucker County, in the eastern part of the state, higher elevation than most of West Virginia, and it sits in a long, flat basin, surrounded by ridges that come down close and steep. The valley floor is wetland and bog and open meadow, unusual for mountain country, and the town of Davis is the main community, a few hundred people, old enough to have most of its original buildings still standing or mostly standing. When I say old, I mean old in the way Appalachian towns are old, which is not picturesque old, but worn-in old. The kind of old where the buildings have been used hard across several generations and then repaired with whatever was available. And the result is something that has no pretension, because pretension stopped being practical about 100 years ago. My family has been in Tucker County for 5 generations. My great-great-grandparents came there when the timber companies moved in and stayed when the timber companies left, which is the story of a lot of Tucker County families. We've been there long enough that when I say I know that county, I mean I know it the way, something you grew up inside of. Every road and every ridge name and every family name and every local piece of lore that gets passed around at church suppers and at funerals and at the particular kind of gatherings that small Appalachian towns have, where the business of the day is secondary to the catching up on everyone's business generally. I've been telling what happened to me in that town for 10 years now, and nobody in the family thinks I'm lying, which is the most I can say about it, and which means something coming from a family of practical mountain people who do not have patience for the dramatic. My aunt, who is the most skeptical person I know, heard it and said, "I believe you," and changed the subject. And that response, more than anything, is why I finally decided to put it on record somewhere outside the family. I want to tell you something about Davis specifically before I tell you what happened there. Davis is small enough that the entire business district is walkable in 15 minutes, and it has the particular character of a mountain town that survived the end of its original economy by becoming something else. In this case, a gateway to the wilderness areas and the state parks. The old buildings are still there, most of them repurposed but not erased. And the town has the layered quality that comes from use across several eras. And I want to tell you about the cemetery beside the church, because the cemetery is part of the context. The cemetery is genuinely old, with stones going back to the early 1800s, and the family names on those stones are the family names of the county. To walk that cemetery is to walk through the county's genealogy, and I've done it many times. The 2 small stones I found the morning after the infants' graves are in a section where the ground is oldest, and the stones are small and white and simply carved, carrying the dates and the names and nothing else. The economy of grief on old mountain gravestones is its own kind of eloquence. I was 24 when it happened. I'd come back to Davis for my grandmother's 80th birthday, a big family event, people coming from 3 states. And I was staying at my grandmother's house, on the north side of town, the house she'd been in since before my father was born. I want to tell you what Davis looks like when you've been away for several years and come back, because the return changes the seeing. I'd been living in Virginia, in a city, and the return to Tucker County always gave me a double vision for the first day or two. The city overlaid on the mountain, the scale of everything recalibrated from metropolitan to small mountain town. Davis is not large. The main street, the church, the cemetery, the old buildings that have been there since the timber days. It's all close together and low and human-scaled in a way that cities are not. And coming back to it always gave me a clarity about the place that I think I lost by being there continuously. You see things clearly when you've been away. That's partly why I saw her when I did, I've come to think. I came back from away with fresh eyes, eyes that hadn't been dulled to the specific quality of Davis by daily familiarity. And when I walked that side street to the church in the golden September evening, I was seeing it the way you see something you love after an absence, with the attention that an absence requires. And she was there to be seen. I was 24 when it happened. I'd come back to Davis for my grandmother's 80th birthday, a big family event, people coming from 3 states. And I was staying at my grandmother's house on the north side of town, the house she'd been in since before my father was born. Old house, wood frame set back from the road with a garden and an apple tree in the yard that my grandfather planted the year they were married, and that still produces every fall. I love that house. I'd spent every summer of my childhood in it, and I knew it the way you know a place you've loved since before you had language for it. The specific smell of the rooms and the sound of the floors and the way the light came through the kitchen window in the morning. The birthday party was on a Saturday, and by Sunday most of the family had gone home, and I stayed an extra day because my grandmother and I had a good relationship, and I wasn't ready to leave. We spent Sunday doing the quiet things you do when the event is over, and it's just the two of you again. She gardened, I read, we had lunch, and we talked in the slow way that isn't about anything specific and is actually about everything. And Sunday evening I walked downtown, which in Davis means walking maybe 4 blocks to where the old storefronts are, because I wanted to be in the town for a little while before I left, the way you want to be in a place you're going to miss. It was late September, cooling off, the light going golden and long. I walked the main block and back, and then I turned down the side street that goes toward the old church, which I always walk past because the church is beautiful, and because the cemetery beside it has family names going back 200 years. I've walked that route 100 times. I know it cold. And I saw a woman standing in front of the church. She was standing on the stone path that leads to the front door, not in the cemetery, but on the path, with her back to me, looking at the church door. She was wearing clothes that were wrong for September, a long dress, dark, the kind of clothes you'd see in old photographs of Appalachian women, heavy fabric, high collar. I thought at first it was someone from one of the local heritage events, the kind where people dress in period clothes, but there were no events that weekend, and she was alone. I was maybe 60 feet away when I first saw her. I kept walking toward the church the way you keep walking when you see someone on a route you're on. And as I got closer, I noticed her stillness, which was not the stillness of someone waiting for someone else or the stillness of someone admiring a building. It was absolute stillness. She was not shifting her weight or adjusting her position or doing anything a standing person does. She was as still as the stone path under her feet. I got to maybe 30 feet before I stopped. Not because I made a decision to stop, but because my body stopped. I've thought about that specific moment for 10 years, the moment before I had a reason to stop when I stopped anyway. When something in my nervous system registered something before my conscious mind had the information. I stood there on that side street in the September evening, and I looked at this woman on the church path, and I felt the particular cold feeling that has nothing to do with temperature. She turned around, and I want to describe what I saw as precisely as I can, because precision is the only thing I have to offer here. She turned around and she had a face. It wasn't a blur or an absence. She had a face, eyes, and a nose and a mouth, and the face was the face of an old woman, very old, deeply lined, and the expression on it was not anger or malice or any of the things you'd expect from a horror story. It was grief. She looked at me with an expression of such complete grief that I felt it land on me like a physical weight. Grief so old and so complete that it had stopped being about any specific thing and had become its own condition. She looked at me for maybe 3 seconds, and then she was not there. Not a vanishing, not a fading, not a retreating into shadow. One moment she was on the path, and the next moment the path was empty and the evening was just the evening. The golden light in the old church and the empty stone path leading to the door. I stood there for a while. Then I walked back to my grandmother's house and I sat in the kitchen, and my grandmother made tea without asking because she could see I needed tea. And after a while, I told her what I'd seen, and she was quiet for a long time. And then she asked me where on the path the woman had been standing, how far from the door. And I said about midway, and she nodded. And she told me. She said the church, the original building, had been there since the 1850s, and that in the early years of the town, a woman had lost children there, 2 of them both in infancy, within a year of each other, buried in the yard beside the church. My grandmother said the old people used to say the woman had stood on that path for years afterward, going to the door and not going in, grieving in the way that people who've lost children in infancy sometimes grieve, which is a grief that doesn't move through the normal stages because there's nothing to move through, no memories long enough to hold on to, just the loss. She said the old people said she stood on that path for years, and that when she finally died, she kept standing there, because standing there was what she'd learned to do, and she didn't know what else to do with herself. My grandmother said all this the way she said most things, matter-of-factly, the way you discuss local history. She said the woman had been seen on that path by various family members over the years, that it was a known thing in the family, the way certain things are known in old families in old places, and that the grief on her face was always the same, and that nobody who'd seen it had ever thought she was a threat, because grief that old and that complete doesn't threaten, it just is. It just persists. It stands on the path it knows, and looks at the door it can't go through. Before I left my grandmother's house that Monday morning, she told me one more thing, and I want to include it because it changed what the experience meant to me. She said the woman on the path had been seen by members of the family going back several generations. Her own mother had seen her once, on a winter evening, standing on the path in the cold, and her grandmother had seen her, and there was a telling of it that went back at least to the early 20th century. A piece of knowledge passed from generation to generation, the way pieces of place. Specific knowledge get passed, not as a warning, not as a scary story, just as something you should know if you're going to be in Davis and walk past that church. She said it in the same tone she used for the piece of knowledge about which stretch of the Blackwater River flooded first, and which neighbors kept dogs that needed to be given a wide berth. Information about the place, useful information, offered to me now that I was old enough to receive it. And she said one more thing that I've thought about more than anything else. She said the family's understanding, going back as far as the telling went, was that the woman on the path was not there in the sense of being trapped or unresolved. And then she told me something else, something she hadn't told me when I was younger, because I'd been too young for it. She said that when she was a girl, her own grandmother had brought her to the cemetery beside the church and had walked her to the 2 small stones, the infants' graves, and had told her about the woman in the path in the way that I was hearing it now, the family's way of passing on the piece of local knowledge that was theirs specifically. She said her grandmother had said, "You'll know her if you see her, and what you'll feel is the grief, and you should let the grief land on you rather than stepping back from it, because the grief is old, and it is what she has to give, and receiving it is what you can give her." My grandmother said she'd been about my age when she heard that instruction, and that the first time she'd seen the woman on the path, she'd done what her grandmother told her. She'd let the grief land, and that she'd stood in it for a moment, in the full weight of a mother's grief for her children, and that she'd understood something about grief and about the world that she wouldn't have understood otherwise. She didn't tell me that part when I was young. She told me the historical facts, the children and the years, and the standing on the path. But the instruction, let the grief land, receive it. That's what you can give her. She told me only in those last months, when she was old enough to trust me with it. And I think about that instruction when I think about the September evening, and I think about whether I did it, whether I stood in the grief long enough to let it land, or whether I was too startled and too young and too caught in my own response to do the thing my grandmother would have known to do. I'd like to think I managed it for those 3 seconds. I hope I did. She said the family's understanding, going back as far as the telling went, was that the woman on the path was not there in the sense of being trapped or unresolved or unable to move on, in the ghost story sense. She said the family's understanding was that she was there because that was where she needed to be, that the path between the world and the door of the church was the right place for a grief that couldn't go in but couldn't leave either, and that her being there was not suffering in the way that we think of suffering, but something more like a state of being, an ongoing condition that was hers and that she was in by her own nature, not by anyone's cruelty or any unfinished business. The grief was her. She was the grief. And the grief stood on the path in the autumn light and looked at the door and looked at the people who passed. And the family knew her and was not afraid of her and considered her, in some sense, part of the church, part of the place, the same way the stones in the cemetery were part of the place. I went back to the cemetery the next morning before I left, and I found the 2 small stones, the children's names and their dates, both in the same year, one in March and one in October. I stood there for a while the way you stand at a grave when you don't know what else to do. Before I drove home, I went inside the church itself, not for a service, just to stand inside it for a few minutes, to be in the space she stood outside of, to understand something about the door from the other side. The interior was everything. An old Appalachian church interior is plain, wood, the pews worn smooth by generations, the simple altar, the windows letting in the mountain light without prettifying it, the stillness of 170 years of prayer and grief and celebration settled into the floor and the walls. I stood in the back and I looked toward the altar and I thought about what she stood outside of. Whatever her faith had been in life, she had stood at the door of this place for 170 years, unable to enter, not unwilling, unable. Something in the grief was too large or too particular to take through that door. The church's consolations were for the living, for people who could still receive comfort. And her grief had moved past the place where comfort could reach it. It stood at the door because the door was as close as it could get. I walked the path myself before I left. I stood midway between the gate and the door where she'd been, and I looked at the door and I understood something about the standing. Standing at a door you can't enter is not failure, and it's not defeat. It's a form of devotion. It's being as close as you can be to what you love and cannot have, choosing the threshold over retreat. She'd been at the threshold for 170 years. That's not tragedy, that's fidelity. And then I drove back to Virginia, and I've thought about it, about her, about the grief that stood on that path for 170 years. About what it means that grief that complete leaves a mark so deep that it keeps standing there long after the person carrying it is gone. I want to tell you about going back to Davis with my own children because that's the visit that settled something for me. My children were 12 and 14 at the time, and I take them back to Tucker County every year or two because I think it matters for them to know where they're from, and that trip we did what I always do. We walked the town and the cemetery, and we stopped at my grandmother's house, which my cousin now lives in, and we had the kind of family visit that is partly about the present and mostly about the past. On the last evening, I took my kids to walk past the church, same route I'd walked at 24. And as we turned down the side street, I told them about the woman on the path, the whole of it, the way my grandmother had told me the whole of it. They listened with the quality of attention that teenagers sometimes give to things that they recognize as real. Not the polite listening they give to adult information, but the other kind. The kind where the information is landing somewhere important. And my older one, my daughter, said after a moment, "Is she there now?" And I looked at the path, and the path was empty, and I said I didn't know. I'd never seen her again. I'd only seen her that once. And my daughter said, "But she's still there, right? Like she's part of the place." And I said, "I thought so, yes." And she nodded, and we stood at the edge of the path for a minute, the three of us, looking at the old church and the stones in the yard and the path going to the door. And my daughter said, "It's kind of beautiful, isn't it, being that devoted to something?" And I said, "Yes, it's kind of beautiful." We stood there a little longer, and then we walked back to my cousin's house and had our supper. And I thought about a woman who'd been standing on that path since the 1850s, out of love for what was on the other side of the door she couldn't go through. And I thought my daughter had the right word for it. I've been back to Davis many times since. I walk past the church every time. I look at the path every time. I think about fidelity. I've come to believe, after 10 years of carrying this account, that the woman on the path is one of the truest things I've ever seen. And by true, I mean consistent with what the world actually is, rather than what we're comfortable thinking it is. What the world actually is, I think, is a place where love that has been fully lived and fully felt leaves a mark that does not simply disappear when the person who carried it stops carrying it. The mark persists. It stands where it stood. It looks at the door it looked at. And the people who have the capacity to see it can see it. And the seeing is not frightening if you come to it with the right understanding, which is that what you're seeing is not a warning or a haunting, but a devotion, a love that found the only form available to it and held that form for as long as there was anything to hold. She's been on that path since the 1850s. She will probably be on it in the 2050s, long after I'm gone, long after anyone currently living remembers her name or her children's names, or the year the two stones were placed in the yard beside the church. She'll be there, looking at the door, as close as she can be to what she loves. That's not a tragedy. That's the longest kind of faithfulness there is. I hope she knows, if knowing is something she can do, that she's been seen, that her grief has been received by the family and the town, and the visitors who've walked that path and paused and felt the weight of it landing on them. I hope the being seen has been, in some small way, the company she stood on that path to find. I've been back to Davis many times since. I walk past the church every time. I've seen the path empty every time since that September evening. But I look. I always look. And I think about what my grandmother said about the doors she couldn't go through. And I think about her children and the ground beside the church, and I think there is nothing I could have done or said to her that September evening that would have helped her. But I hope the seeing counted for something. I hope being seen, being witnessed in that old grief, was something rather than nothing. It's the best I had to offer. Story 2. My name is Raymond, and I'm 68 years old, and I've lived in Grundy, Virginia my entire life, except for 2 years in the Army and 1 year in Roanoke when I thought I wanted to try city living, which I didn't. Grundy is in Buchanan County in southwestern Virginia, right up against the Kentucky line. Coal country, and I say that up front because the relationship between coal country and its history is something you need to understand before this account makes sense to you. When coal comes into a mountain community, it changes everything. The economy, the landscape, the families, the way people relate to each other and to the land. And when coal leaves, it changes everything again. And Buchanan County has been through both of those changes and is living in the aftermath of the second one. I'm not making a political statement. I'm giving you context because what I experienced is connected to that history in ways I didn't understand when it happened and have spent decades trying to understand since. I worked in the mines from when I was 19 until the accident when I was 41. And after the accident, I couldn't go back underground. And I found other work. And I stayed in Grundy because Grundy is where my family is, and where I'm from and where I intend to be buried. I know this town the way a man knows a town he's lived in all his life, which includes knowing the things about it that people who come from outside never learn. The underground history as much as the visible one. The losses and the accommodations and the things that don't get talked about at the town council meetings. I want to tell you about what happened to me in the winter of 1998, which is 26 years ago now, in which I have never fully told anyone, not my wife while she was alive and not my children, and not my closest friends. The reason I haven't told it is not that I'm ashamed of it or that I think anyone would think I was crazy. The reason is that telling it requires me to go back into it, and going back into it is not something I've ever wanted to do on anyone's schedule but my own. I'm doing it now because I'm 68, and I think it should be on record somewhere, and because I heard someone else's account on this channel that made me feel like this was the right place to put mine. Before I get to what happened, I want to tell you what Grundy is and what working in the mines means there. Because this account doesn't land right without that foundation. Grundy sits in a narrow valley where the levee now holds back the Lavisa Fork, a valley so narrow that the town rebuilt itself on a hillside when flooding became unmanageable. A town that was literally moved up the slope, which is the kind of thing that happens in places where people are committed enough to the place to do the extraordinary work of moving it rather than leaving it. Coal shaped everything about Buchanan County, the economy, the landscape, the families. Who stayed and who left and who came back and who didn't. The mines went deep into the ridges and the men went with them, and the relationship between the miners and the mines is a relationship between people and the earth itself. And it's not abstract, it's daily and physical. The specific smell of the coal dust, and the specific darkness underground, and the specific sounds of machinery working and rock settling and water moving in the seams. I know those things because I spent 20 years in that environment before the accident. They're part of me the way the county is part of me, permanent. When I say the accident, I don't need to say more than that, because people from coal country don't need more than that. Roof fall. 3 men on my crew, I came out, 2 of them didn't. That's the account of the accident, and I won't expand it because it belongs to those men and their families, and not to this story, except to say that it's the reason I understood, when the thing started happening at the security job, exactly what I was hearing, and exactly what it meant. It was January. I was working a night security job at a shuttered section of the processing facility east of town. The kind of job that exists to satisfy an insurance requirement, more than for any practical security purpose. 4 nights a week, midnight to 8, walking through empty buildings and checking in on a schedule, the most boring work I've ever done in my life. I'd been doing it for about 3 months when the thing started. The thing that started was small. I'd be walking through a particular section of the facility, a long corridor of old processing equipment, heavy machinery that hadn't run in years, dusty and cold and smelling of industrial oil and old coal dust. And I would hear from ahead of me on the corridor the sound of machinery running. Not loud, not the full roar of production, but the low hum and thud of machinery that's idling, that's ready to go, that's waiting for something to process. A sound I knew from 20 years in and around that equipment. I'd stop and listen, and the sound was there, and I'd walk toward it, and as I got closer, it would stop. And when I reached the machinery, it was cold and silent and unpowered, as it had been for years. I reported it to the day supervisor the first time it happened. He nodded and wrote it down, and that was the end of it. The second time I reported it, he nodded and wrote it down again, and told me the old equipment sometimes moved air, in ways that sounded like running machinery, which I didn't believe. And I think he knew I didn't believe, but there wasn't anything else to say about it. So I let it go. It kept happening. 2, 3 times a night. The sound from ahead of me on the corridor. And I wanted to describe the full quality of those nights, because there's something in the description I haven't given you yet. The facility was old and large, and in a section of the county that had been cleared of most habitation. And at 2 or 3 in the morning in January, it was as isolated as anywhere I've been. The cold was Sirius Mountain. January cold, below 20 most nights, and the facility's heating systems were only running at minimal levels, enough to prevent pipe damage, not enough to make the building comfortable. And I wore my heavy work clothes and I still felt the cold. The moonlight came through the high windows in certain sections and made long rectangles on the concrete floor. And the machinery stood in the dark between those rectangles, massive and still and dust-covered. And the smell was the coal dust and the machine oil that I knew from 20 years underground. And in that smell, and that cold and that dark, the sounds of machinery running and men calling over the noise were, this is the word I keep coming back to, they were right. The sounds fit the environment in a way that I think is the most specific quality of those nights. The quality I haven't fully communicated. In that building in January, in the cold and the dark and the smell, the sounds of a shift in progress were the sounds that belonged there. Not frightening and not wrong. Right. The building was a processing facility. And the processing facility of the city was processing in January, the way it had always done in January. And I was the only thing in it that didn't belong, the only anachronism. The security guard in a building that was doing what it had always done without needing a security guard. It kept happening. 2-3 times a night, the sound from ahead of me on the corridor. And I want to be precise about the sound because this matters for what came later. It wasn't random industrial noise. It had the rhythm of running equipment, the specific cadence of machinery doing a job, the cycle you'd hear during a shift when the line was processing coal. It was not the sound of equipment idling or failing or settling. It was the sound of equipment working. About 6 weeks into this, the sounds changed. I was walking the corridor at about 2 a.m, and I heard not the machinery, but voices. Men's voices from inside the processing area, talking and calling out to each other the way men call out over running machinery, the volume and the tone of work communication. Not the words, not specific, just the general pattern of men coordinating over loud equipment. I stopped dead in the corridor, and I stood there and I listened, and the voices continued, not directed at me, not reacting to my presence, just going about their business in the dark ahead of me. I want to be honest about what I did next, which was that I walked toward the voices. I know how that sounds, but I'm a man who spent 20 years in coal mines, and the sounds I was hearing were the sounds of a shift in progress. And a shift in progress in a secured facility in the middle of the night was either a serious unauthorized entry or something I needed to understand. And either way, walking toward it was the correct response. I'm not brave in any particular way. I was doing my job. I walked the length of the corridor and I went into the processing area and it was empty. Dark and cold and silent. The machinery exactly where it always was and had been. Nothing running, no one there. And the voices and the machinery sounds had stopped the moment I crossed through the door, not before, not gradually. The moment my foot crossed the threshold. I stood in that room for a while. I shone my flashlight into every corner and there was nobody there. And there was nothing that could have produced the sound I'd heard. And the sound had been real and present and populated. Dozens of men at work. And now there was only the dark and the cold and the machine oil smell. I want to tell you how I felt walking that corridor in the first weeks before I found the records. Because the feeling was specific and I've thought about it a lot. The sound of machinery running in a powered-down facility would, in most circumstances, produce fear or alarm, and I want to be honest that it produced neither. What it produced was something closer to the feeling I'd had in the mine during a long shift, which is the feeling of being in a working environment, surrounded by the sounds of productive work, the ambient noise of people doing what they know how to do. The sounds were the sounds of a shift in progress. And I'd been in hundreds of shifts in progress, and my body responded to those sounds with the familiar calibration of a working man in a working environment. My mind knew the facility was shut, and the sounds shouldn't be there. My body was ready to go to work. That gap between the mind's knowledge and the body's response is something I've tried to describe to people and mostly failed. It's the gap between the fact of the situation and the feel of the situation. And in that gap was a specific quality of what I encountered on those nights. It didn't feel like a haunting. It felt like a shift. I started going to the library in the afternoons before my shifts. The newspaper archives. I found the record I was looking for in about 2 weeks. The accident had been reported in the local paper, and as accidents were, and the reporting was factual and spare, the way local newspaper reporting of industrial accidents in coal country tends to be the date, the location, the number of men, the names. The names. I read the names and I had the specific feeling of putting a final piece of information into place. The completing of a picture that had been assembling for weeks in my head. I read the names and I thought about the voices I'd heard in that processing area, the men coordinating over the machinery. And I thought about the fact that those men had names and families and histories, that they'd been working a shift when the accident happened, that they'd been in the middle of the ordinary work of an ordinary shift, and that the shift had continued in that building ever since. I asked around after carefully about the accident, about the families. I found one daughter of one of the men who'd been in the accident, an older woman by then, and I talked to her at a community event where the opportunity arose naturally, and I told her I'd been working in the facility and had heard something that had made me go to the records, and that I'd found the account of the accident. She listened and she nodded and she said, "They worked good, those men. Not they were good men, though, that too, but specifically they worked good. The competence and the commitment of them was the thing she led with, the thing she wanted said." And I thought about the sounds on the corridor, the machinery running, the voices calling out over the noise, the work being done in the cold and the dark. And I thought, yes, they worked good, and whatever's still running in that building in January knows how to do the work. 30 years later, still working good. I found the record I was looking for in about 2 weeks. The processing facility had been one of the major operations in the county, and in its years of operation, it had had 2 significant accidents, both fatal, both involving multiple men. And one of those accidents had happened in the specific section I patrolled, in the processing area where the sounds ended. The accident had been in January, not January of any particular recent year. January as a month in the year the accident happened, and the sounds had started in January, the month I was working the job. And I was in January when I was hearing the sounds. I want to tell you something I haven't told anyone, which is about my wife. She died 4 years ago, and she was my companion in all of this. Meaning she lived with me while I worked that job, and she knew something was happening, and she never pressed me about it, and she never minimized it. She had the specific grace of a woman who understood that her husband had been in an accident that killed 2 of his crewmates, and that whatever was happening to him on those winter nights in that building was connected to that accident and to those men, and that the right response was to be present and not to manage. She'd make coffee when I came in at 8 in the morning, and she'd sit with me while I drank it, and sometimes I'd talk, and sometimes I wouldn't, and she received whatever I gave her without requiring more. She was the one who suggested I go to the library, actually. She said, "If it's the men from the accident, you should know their names. Go find their names." I found their names because she told me to, and I said them in that corridor on my last night because she told me to find them. She understood what I was doing in that building in a way I only fully appreciated after she was gone, which is that I was present with men who had been working their shift when something went wrong, who were working it still, who worked it every January, and that my presence was a form of witness, even if I didn't know it at the time, even if I was just a night watchman doing his rounds. I was there. I heard them. The names are in this account. She'd be satisfied with that. I've thought about this for 26 years. I've thought about what it means that the machinery's sounds, the voices, the working sounds of a shift were audible in January and not in the other months I worked that facility. I've thought about whether it was January specifically, the month the accident happened, or whether it was always there and I just happened to start the job in January and notice it. I've thought about what it means that the sounds stopped when I crossed the threshold, whether they stopped because I arrived or whether I arrived at the moment they always stopped, in the ordinary rhythm of a shift, that has been repeating in that building for decades. What I've come to is this, and it's not a dramatic conclusion, but it's the honest one. I think those men are still working. I think the shift they were on when the accident happened has been running in that building in January ever since. Not as haunting in the ghost story sense, as work, as the thing those men knew how to do and were doing when they died, which was running that equipment and calling to each other over the noise and doing the work of a shift. And I think death didn't interrupt that the way we expect death to interrupt things, because the work was too ingrained and too specific and too much a part of who they were to stop just because they did. I want to be precise about what quitting meant for me, because it wasn't a flight. I quit the job in March because I'd thought it through carefully, and I'd decided that the right response to what I'd heard in that building was not continued presence. I'd done what the job required, and I'd found the records, and I'd sat with what the records meant, and I'd come to a conclusion that I haven't changed in 26 years, which is this. Those men are working their shift in that building in January, and they don't need me there. I was a night watchman, hired by an insurance requirement to monitor an empty facility. And the facility wasn't empty, and my being there was irrelevant to what the facility was actually doing. And continuing to be there was a presence that added nothing. I quit with respect, and that's the best I can say about it. What I didn't do was leave without acknowledging it. On my last night, which was in late March, when the sounds had been absent for several weeks, as they'd been absent in February, I walked the full corridor, the length of it, in the cold. And at the door to the processing area, I stopped and I said out loud, to the empty building, to January, to the men whose names I'd found in the newspaper, I said I'd heard them working, and that I hoped the work meant what work had always meant to the people doing it, which was dignity and presence and the doing of something useful in the world. I said the names, all of them, the ones in the article. I said the names out loud in that corridor, and the corridor was quiet. It was March, and the sounds were gone for the season. And then I finished my last rounds, and I handed in my keys in the morning, and I didn't go back. I quit that job in March, when the sounds had stopped for the month, and I'd had time to think, and I've never worked nights since. And every January, wherever I am, I think about that corridor and that threshold and the sound of men working in the cold dark, doing what they knew how to do, calling out over the machinery, getting through the shift. I think about them every January. I think they deserve to be thought about. I want to tell you what January is like for me now, 26 years later, so you understand what I mean when I say I think about them. Every January, wherever I am, in the second or third week of the month, there's a day when the quality of the cold and the quality of the light and the smell of the air, the specific combination of winter in the mountains, produces the same feeling I had in that corridor. Not frightening, not distressing. The feeling of a working shift. The feeling of men doing what they know how to do in a cold building. Calling to each other over the machinery, getting through the work. I've had it in my living room. I've had it in my truck. I've had it standing on the porch in the January dark. It lasts maybe 30 seconds and then it's gone. And I've come to understand it as what it is, which is the memory the county has of those men's January, pressing briefly against the present year's January, a resonance. The same note struck again. I don't resist it. I stop what I'm doing and I stand in it for its 30 seconds. And I think about the names I found in the newspaper, the names I said in the corridor on my last night. And then the moment passes, and January goes back to being January, and I go back to my regular day. And the shift continues in that building without me, the way it always has, and the way it always will. I think about them every January. I think they deserve to be thought about. Story 3. I teach 6th grade in a small school in Harlan County, Kentucky, and I've been doing it for 16 years. I'm not from Harlan originally. I grew up in central Kentucky, came here for the job, and stayed because the job was good and the people were good. And eventually, this is just where I live, where I know people, where I've built a life, I mention this because being an outsider who stayed is a specific position in an Appalachian community. Not insider and not tourist, somewhere in between, and it comes with a particular kind of seeing, which is that you're aware of things the lifelong locals have stopped noticing because those things are part of the texture of the place for them. And at the same time, you're not aware of the things you can only know if you grew up there. I try to use both parts of that position, the awareness of the unfamiliar and the respect for what I don't know. I want to tell you about a student I had 8 years ago. I'll call her Dessa, which is not her name, because she's in her 20s now and living her own life, and I don't have her permission to talk about her, and because what I'm going to tell you is partly her story and partly mine, and I want to draw that line carefully. Dessa was the best student I've ever had in 16 years of teaching, not the most academically gifted, though she was very smart, but the most fully present in the way that some children are fully present in a room, where you feel the quality of their attention as a specific force, where the room is different when they're in it. She was also, for reasons I came to understand gradually, one of the most careful children I've ever taught. Careful in the sense of weighing her words before she said them, and choosing what to show and what to keep private with the precision that seemed more adult than 11. I want to tell you a little about Harlan County before I tell you about Dessa. Harlan County is one of the counties in southeastern Kentucky where the mountains come down hardest and the history is most layered. Bloody Harlan, they called it in the labor struggle years. And that name lasted because names like that last when they earn their keeping. But it's also a place of deep community, the kind of neighbor knows neighbor fabric that forms in isolated mountain places and is stronger for the isolation. The people who stay in Harlan County stay on purpose. Dessa's family was one of the families whose roots went deep there. Not the courthouse names or the mine owner names, but one of the families that had been there quietly for generations, farming and then mining and then making do with whatever work the county offered. She carried that long history in her bones without knowing she carried it, an oldness in the eyes that sat alongside the ordinary 11-year-old business of school and lunch and kickball. I'm going to tell you about 3 things that happened in my classroom that year, and then I'm going to tell you what I learned about the end of it, because the 3 things only make sense with the end. The first thing was in October. I'd assigned the class a family history project, which I do every year, simple genealogy. Talk to your older relatives. Find out what you can about your family's history in this county. Most kids bring back a page or 2 and some old photographs. Dessa brought back a ledger book. Not a copy, the actual ledger, which she told me had been in her family since her great-great-grandmother's time, a household accounts book from the early 1900s. And she'd been told she could bring it to class to show me, but couldn't leave it at school. I looked through it with her, and it was exactly what it appeared to be. Household accounts, dates, and expenditures, the daily record of a life, and it was in extraordinary condition for its age. When I asked Dessa where her family kept it, she said in the house, in the same place it had always been. I asked if the house was old. She said it was the family's first house, the one her great-great-grandmother had built. I said, "The house is still standing?" She gave me the look that I'd learned meant I'd said something that revealed my outsider status. And she said, "Yes, of course it's still standing." I want to expand on the ledger because I've thought about it many times since. Dessa brought it to school in a canvas bag, carefully, the way you'd transport something that matters. And she set it on my desk and waited while I opened it. The entries were in a hand that was confident and practiced, the handwriting of someone who kept accounts all their life and knew the proportions of the letters as naturally as they knew their own face. The first entries were from the 1900s, I estimated from context, and they recorded exactly what you'd expect: household purchases, egg and butter sales, the small economic transactions of a rural household, feed bought at the mill, calico for a dress, wages paid to a helper for harvest, the daily arithmetic of keeping a house going. But scattered through the ordinary accounts were entries that were different in character, and I only noticed them because I was looking carefully. They weren't marked differently, weren't in a different hand or different ink. They were just there among the household accounts, as if they were the same kind of entry. Things like apple tree in flower, 3 weeks early, or the cold came back to the cellar room, or, and this one stopped me, ours quilt back in the chest was on the bed this morning. Simple notations, brief, in the same accounting hand as the household entries, as if the movements of the quilt and the apple tree's bloom and the quality of the air in the cellar room were domestic facts of the same order as the egg sales and the calico. The house recorded alongside the ledger of the house. I looked at Dessa over the top of the ledger, and she was watching me with the weighing expression, and she said, "That's the house one." I said, "What do you mean?" She said R was her great-great-grandmother, who started the ledger. She said the quilt was hers, and it was in the chest where it lived, and she'd sometimes take it out and put it on the bed where it used to be. I said, "Who would take it out?" She looked at me steadily and said, "The house." The second thing was in January. Dessa came in one morning looking like she hadn't slept, and I kept an eye on her through the day, and in the afternoon I found a chance to ask if everything was all right. She said yes, she just hadn't been sleeping well. I asked why, and she was quiet for a moment, doing the weighing thing, and then she said that something had been moving in the house at night. Not a person, not an intruder. She said it very clearly, this is not a person, and she said it with a certainty that told me she'd already been through the process of determining that. She said things moved. Objects in specific places ended up in slightly different positions. Things in the kitchen would be arranged differently. Things that belonged to her great-great-grandmother. The old household objects that had been in the house since the early 1900s would be in different places. She said it had been happening as long as she could remember, and that it usually didn't bother her, but that lately it had been more active than usual, and she wasn't sleeping through it the way she normally did. I want to be honest about my internal response to this conversation, because I'm a teacher and I'm trained to take children's reports seriously, and also trained to distinguish between a child describing real disturbance and a child describing normal childhood anxiety. What I felt in that conversation was that Dessa was in neither of those categories. She was describing something she'd lived with her entire life that was normal to her in the way that the ledger book and the first family house were normal to her, and that had recently become an operational inconvenience because she wasn't sleeping. There was no fear in how she described it, no attempt to make it dramatic, and she clearly wasn't asking me to fix it. She was just answering my question about why she wasn't sleeping. That quality, the reporting of it as ordinary background fact, is what I've held on to for 8 years. The third thing was in May. I'd arranged a school presentation about local history, and I'd asked several families in the community to bring in historical objects from their homes, the kind of thing I do periodically, to connect the classroom to the actual community history. Dessa brought the ledger again, and she also brought a small wooden box that she said had belonged to her great-great-grandmother. It was a simple box, handmade, with a carved design on the lid, and inside was a collection of small objects buttons, a thimble, a folded piece of cloth, a small coin, ordinary objects of a life. When I held the box to examine it, I felt something I wanted to describe as precisely as I can, because it's the most important detail in the account and the hardest to convey. I felt the weight of the object's age. Not literally, I know what weight is, but holding that box, I had a clear and unambiguous sense of the years in it, the years of the objects being handled and kept and passed down, and the sense of someone's presence attached to that keeping. Not a specific or frightening sense, just the clear impression of someone who cared about those objects very much, who had cared about them for a long time, who was still, in some sense that I don't have technical language for, caring about them. I put the box down fairly quickly, and I was careful not to show Dessa that I'd had any particular reaction to it. What I learned at the end of that school year was that Dessa's family was leaving Harlan County. Her parents had found work elsewhere and they were going. Dessa told me before the last day, and she was matter-of-fact about it, the way she was matter-of-fact about everything. But underneath the matter-of-factness was something I could see was complicated for her. And I asked her gently how she felt about leaving the family house. And she said, and I'm going to quote her as close as I can, because the quote matters. She said the house won't be happy about it. Not in a dramatic way, not like a haunted house movie. In the voice of a kid who has lived with the house her whole life and knows its moods the way you know the moods of someone you've always lived with. The house won't be happy about it. And I asked her if she was worried about that, and she said, no, she'd already talked to it about it, told it she was going and that she'd come back, and that she thought it understood. She said, it's been dealing with people going and coming back for 100 years. It knows how that goes. I've thought about Dessa for 8 years, and I've thought about what teaching in a place like Harlan County for 16 years has done to my own instincts and perceptions, which is something that the Dessa account made me examine in a way I hadn't before. I came to Harlan County as an outsider, as I said, from central Kentucky, and I arrived with the instincts and assumptions of someone who'd grown up in a place with less history and less isolation, and a less layered relationship between the living and what came before them. And 16 years in Harlan County has changed some of those assumptions, slowly and without drama, in the way that deep immersion in a place changes you without your necessarily noticing the change until something makes you look. The change that the Dessa account made me look at was the change in how I received children's reports of unusual things. I was trained in my education courses and in the professional literature of teaching to receive children's unusual reports with clinical attention and to distinguish between reports that indicate psychological distress and reports that are normal childhood imaginative expression and reports that indicate something in the child's actual environment that needs addressing. I'm good at that clinical distinction. I've gotten better at it over 16 years. What I wasn't trained for, and what Harlan County taught me, is the fourth category. The report that is accurate and that describes something real in the child's environment that the clinical categories don't cover. Dessa was in the fourth category. She was not distressed, she was not being imaginative, and what was in her environment was real. She was reporting it accurately, and she was managing it competently, and she was an 11-year-old child who had grown up inside a house with a presence in it and had developed a practical and respectful relationship with that presence that was entirely healthy. The house was good, she said. It was. I've thought about Dessa for 8 years. I've thought about a girl who grew up inside a house with a 100-year presence in it and learned to communicate with that presence the way you learn to communicate with anything you live with, practically in the language of daily life, arranging things and moving things and talking to it when a conversation was needed. I've thought about what it means that the presence in that house was not frightening to someone who'd grown up with it, that it expressed itself through the arrangement of household objects the same way it always had, and she'd grown up sleeping through it, and only mentioned it to me when it was temporarily more active than usual. I've thought about the weight of that small wooden box and the sense of someone still caring about the things in it, still keeping them the way you keep the things that matter. And I've thought about that sentence. The house won't be happy about it, and what it means that an 11-year-old could say it with the flat certainty of someone describing the weather. I want to tell you one more thing Dessa told me in that last conversation before she left, that I've been thinking about for 8 years and that I've decided is the most important part of the account, even though it's the simplest part. I asked her as carefully as I could what the house felt like, whether it was frightening to live in a house with that much presence in it. She looked at me with the steadiness she always had, and she thought about it for a moment. And then she said, "It's not frightening." She said, "It's like having someone who really loves the place always around." She said sometimes it was quiet for weeks, and sometimes it was active, and she'd learned to read the difference, the way you learn to read the moods of anyone you live with, and that when it was active, it was usually because something was happening in the family or in the season that was significant, that it seemed to respond to the significant moments, births and deaths, and the first cold snap, and the return of someone who'd been gone. She said it was most active in the spring, which she thought might have something to do with her great-great-grandmother's love of her kitchen garden, and that in the spring you could feel the house's pleasure in the warming weather, the way you could feel a person's pleasure. She said, "It's a good house." And I thought about the objects moving, the quilt returned to the bed, the kitchen arrangements, things that sound frightening as descriptions, and that she experienced as the house being domestic, the house expressing its own preferences about how things should be, the house curating itself, according to the memory of the woman who'd built it and kept it and loved it. An 11-year-old describing the persistence of her great-great-grandmother's love in the walls of her house as a good house. The house is good. It loves the place. It tends to the things that mattered. She was right. That's a good house. I hope she went back. I hope the house understood about the going. I think it probably did. I want to tell you one last thing about Dessa. The thing that connects her account to my 16 years in that county in a way I haven't fully said. I've been a teacher for long enough now to have had several hundred students, and of those several hundred, the ones I think of with the most frequency are not the most brilliant or the most difficult or the most academically successful. They're the ones who taught me something. Dessa taught me something. She taught me that the relationship between a person and the place they're from can be a complete and fully reciprocal relationship. Not just an attachment or a sentiment or a nostalgia, but a genuine two-way relationship where both parties have a stake, and both parties communicate, and both parties are changed by the exchange. Her house knew her. It responded to the seasons of her family's life. It moved the quilt back to the bed where it belonged. It had preferences about how things were arranged, and she knew the house, knew its moods and its rhythms, communicated with it about significant events, told it she was leaving and when she'd be back. That's a relationship. That's the kind of relationship that most of us have been trained to think is not possible with a place, that we reserve for people, but that she had with the house and that the house had with her across 100 years of her family's occupancy. I think about what it would mean to have that relationship with the place I live. I've been in Harlan County for 16 years, and I've put down roots here, genuinely. The way you put down roots when a place becomes home, and I wonder sometimes if the place knows me yet. If I've been here long enough and paid enough attention to have something like what Dessa had. I don't know. I'm still an outsider in certain deep senses, and maybe the depth of rootedness that makes a place reciprocate requires generations rather than decades. But I pay attention. I keep paying attention. And I hope the county has noticed. I hope she went back. I hope the house understood about the going. I think it probably did. If tonight's accounts are doing what they're supposed to do, the kindest thing you can do is hit subscribe before you get too comfortable. It's the main thing that keeps this channel going. Comments help too. Tell me which account is getting under your skin. Address for submissions is in the description. Back to the mountain towns. Story 4. My grandmother refused to talk about the house on Sawmill Road for the last 15 years of her life, and the refusal was so complete and so consistent that it became its own kind of information. You could ask her anything. My grandmother, she'd talk about the poverty years, about losing a brother in the war, about the flood of 1977 that took the houses on the low side of town. But the house on Sawmill Road, she would not discuss. I want to tell you about Lewisburg and about Greenbrier County, because the character of that place is the context for the account. Lewisburg is genuinely old, one of the oldest incorporated towns in West Virginia, and it has a quality of layered occupation that I find specific to places that have been continuously settled for a very long time. The courthouse, the church, the residential streets with their trees and their old houses, the town looks like a place that knows it's been there a long time and has made peace with the weight of that. And underneath it literally is the cave system. The Greenbrier Valley sits on a karst geology, limestone country, and the caverns go under the town and under the county. And the caverns have been inhabited for more than 10,000 years, longer than almost anywhere in the eastern United States. Bones in those caverns from before the current human era. The ground under Lewisburg is porous and old in a way that I think gives the place a specific quality. The quality of land that has seen many generations of human living and is saturated with it, and that some people are more permeable to than others. My grandmother was, I think, one of the permeable ones. For the last 15 years of her life, and the refusal was so complete and so consistent that it became its own kind of information. You could ask her anything. My grandmother, she'd talk about the poverty years, about losing a brother in the war, about the flood of 1977 that took the houses on the low side of town. She'd talk about hard things with the directness of a woman who decided long ago that hard things were just part of life and not worth softening. But the house on Sawmill Road she would not discuss. If you brought it up, she'd change the subject immediately, with a fluency that told you she'd been changing that subject for a long time and had gotten very good at it. I spent most of my childhood curious about that house and not getting anywhere. And it wasn't until she was in the last months of her life and we were having the kind of conversations you have at the end that she finally told me, because she said someone in the family should know, and she decided it was me. I grew up in Lewisburg, West Virginia, which is in Greenbrier County in the southeastern part of the state, a town of about 4,000 people that has the distinction of being one of the prettiest small towns in the mountains. The old buildings kept up, the streets lined with trees, the kind of place that gets magazine articles written about it periodically. But Lewisburg is also the county seat of Greenbrier County, which is a county with a very long and very deep history. And some of that history is in the ground. Literally, there's a cave system under Lewisburg that includes one of the longest cave rivers in the eastern United States. And the caves have been inhabited by human beings for thousands of years. And the land above the caves has a particular quality that people who are sensitive to such things find notable. I don't believe in the supernatural in any organized sense. I'm a nurse and I've been a nurse for 30 years, and my relationship with reality is empirical and clinical. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is not the product of a credulous mind, and that the account I'm giving you is my grandmother's account, not my own. And I believe it because I knew my grandmother. The house on Sawmill Road was a house my grandmother had lived in for the first 3 years of her marriage. Before she and my grandfather moved to the house they spent the rest of their lives in. It was a rental, an old farmhouse set back from the road in the kind of position that suggests it predates the road, that the road was built around the house rather than the house built along the road. By the time my grandmother lived there, it was already old, already had the quality of a place that had had many families in it. And she said she'd felt that quality from the first day, the sense of layers, of accumulated living. That didn't trouble her particularly because she was a practical woman. And old houses have histories, and that's just the way old houses are. The first winter in that house, she began to dream. And she was precise with me about what she meant by dream. Because my grandmother was always precise when it mattered, she chose her words carefully. She said they were not ordinary dreams. She said ordinary dreams have the quality of images assembled from your own mind, your own memories and fears and desires. And these were different. These were complete. She said they were complete in the way that real experience is complete, with weight and smell and the specific quality of light from specific sources, and the feeling of cold or heat on the skin. And they were not things she had ever experienced or imagined. They were lives she did not know. She saw lives. That's the plainest way I can put her account. And she described what it felt like to be inside those lives in a way that I want to convey, because it's the part of her account I found most significant. The part that's made me think most carefully about what the house on Sawmill Road was actually doing. She said being in those dreamed lives was not like being a spectator. She said it was more like being saturated with a life, the way you're saturated with water when you've been in the rain. The information coming in through every surface rather than through your eyes and ears alone. She said she knew those people's physical sensations, the weight of their bodies in specific positions, the texture of their hands, the specific feeling of cold or heat in specific rooms at specific seasons. She said she knew what it felt like to carry water from the spring up to the house before there was running water, the specific weight and the specific cold of the bucket, and the specific path from the spring in the body of the woman who carried it. She said she knew the exhaustion of certain kinds of labor that she'd never done, and the specific satisfactions of certain kinds of work that she'd never done in the body of someone who had. She said it was an intimate access that felt less like dreaming and more like being granted temporary residence in another person's life, as if the house had opened its contents to her and said, "Here, hold this for a while. Know what it was to be this person in this place." She said that was also why it became too much. Not because the lives were unhappy, many of them were, by the measures of hardship, but the experience of them from the inside was not primarily unhappy. It was primarily human, dense and specific and mortal and limited and rich, the full texture of human lives in a particular place and time. She said 30 or 40 of those a night was simply more than she could hold, more than a person was equipped to carry, and that by the end of that spring, she was losing the boundaries between her life and the life she'd been dreaming. Not in a distressing way, but in the way of someone who has taken on too much weight and needs to set some of it down. She saw lives. That's the plainest way I can put her account. Every night that winter, she dreamed lives she did not know, people she'd never seen. In that house, in that same location, across different eras. She said she saw the house when it was newer, and she saw the house when it was older than she knew it, and she saw it in different states of use and disuse. And the lives in it were specific and detailed and real, in the way real things are real. And she understood while she was in them that she was seeing not imaginations, but recordings. That the house was showing her what it held. That the accumulated weight of all the lives that had been lived in it had not dissipated when those lives ended, but had settled into the structure of the place. The way everything settles into a structure that holds it long enough, and that in sleep, when her conscious mind was out of the way, the house was showing her its contents. She was not frightened for most of that first winter. She found it remarkable and a little overwhelming, and she'd wake up with the weight of 3 or 4 distinct lives in her head, lives she could describe in detail. People whose names she learned and whose faces she knew, and whose daily routines she'd been inside. She told my grandfather about it, and he listened and said it was probably the stress of the move and the new house, which was reasonable, and which she didn't quite believe. She went on living there and going about her life, and every night adding more to the collection in her head, more lives, more names, more faces. The part that changed things was spring, and I want to describe what the spring was like in the house first, because her telling of it was very specific. She said the winter had been dense and complete, the dreams coming every night without exception, and that by March, she'd dreamed so many lives that she'd stopped being able to count them or separate them clearly, that they'd begun to merge in her memory, the specific details of one life bleeding into another. She said it wasn't frightening exactly, it was more like being full in the way you're full after a very large meal. Not sick, but close to the limit of capacity. And she'd started to dream about being in the house, rather than dreaming other lives, as if the house itself was becoming the content of the dreaming, rather than the medium of it. And then the snow went off the ridges and the forsythia came in along the back fence, and she said she felt the house change. She said it in a way that I've been trying to describe correctly ever since, because it's the most remarkable thing she told me and also the hardest to convey. She said the house became pleased, not in an anthropomorphic way, not like a person who's happy. She was precise about this, but in the way a season changes, a shift in the quality of the air and the light and the particular sense of potential in an environment. She said the house in spring had the quality of something that had been patient through a long dormancy and was now fully alive again, and that the aliveness expressed itself in everything. The dreaming more vivid and more active, the waking presences more present, the whole character of the place heightened and warm. She said it was the most beautiful 3 weeks she'd ever spent in any house. Those first 3 weeks of spring in the house on Sawmill Road, even as it was becoming too much for her to hold. The part that changed things was spring. In the spring, she began to see them while she was awake. She was very careful about this in the telling, the way she was careful about the distinction between dreams and complete experience. She said it didn't happen the way ghost sightings are described in stories, a figure in a doorway or a face at a window. She said it was more that the house would become suddenly populous, that she'd be in a room and there would briefly be more in the room than there was supposed to be, not in a way she could see directly, but in the way you're aware of people at the edge of your vision, the peripheral sense of presence, and sometimes, not often, not in a frightening way, she'd see a face, just a face in a moment, clear and specific, someone she recognized from the winter's dreaming, someone whose name she knew, looking at her from across a room with the mild curiosity of a person encountering an unfamiliar face in a familiar place. She told me it wasn't frightening. I want to be clear about that because I think it's important. She was not frightened of what was in that house. She was, she said, overwhelmed by it in the way that you can be overwhelmed by something that is too large for you to carry. Not because it's hostile, but because there is simply too much of it. She said by the end of the spring, she was dreaming 40 lives a night, complete lives, and holding them while she was awake, in the sense of being inside all of those histories simultaneously, of carrying all of those people's accumulated experience in her head while trying to live her own life in the present, was a weight she couldn't continue with. She and my grandfather moved out in June, a year before their lease was up. She paid the penalty, and she didn't explain to the landlord, and she never went back. And she refused to talk about it for the rest of her life, which I now understand was not because the experience was traumatic, but because talking about it meant going back into it. And she'd spent 40 years carefully not going back into it, carrying those 30 or 40 lives in her memory and keeping them at a manageable distance by not examining them. And she'd gotten good at the distance, and she didn't want to disrupt it. Before I tell you about the names she gave me, I want to tell you about one specific life, the one she told me in the most detail and with the most certainty, because it's the one that stayed with me most clearly and the one I was most able to partially verify. She said the life she'd dreamed most completely was a woman who had been in the house in the 1870s or thereabouts, the first generation after the original builder. And she described this woman, her name, which I'll hold private, her face, her daily routine in that house across all 4 seasons, with the specificity of someone who had lived alongside this woman for months. She said this woman had been a reader in an era when reading was unusual for women in that community. That she'd had a small collection of books that she kept in a specific place in the house, that she'd read in the evenings by the fire after the household work was done, and that the house had been suffused with the quality of her reading, with the specific presence of a mind fully engaged in something, and that this quality was more present than almost any other quality in the accumulated lives of the house. My grandmother said she thought the woman's reading, the specific practice of full mental presence in that house had left the deepest mark of any of the lives, had contributed most to the house's capacity to show her what it showed her. A woman reading by a fire in the 1870s in a house in Greenbrier County had left such a clear imprint of engaged presence that it was still legible 100 years later in the dreams of a woman sleeping in the same rooms. I looked in the county records for the name. A woman with that name appears in the 1880 census living in the county, in a location consistent with Sawmill Road. That's all. She existed. She was there. She told me in those last months because, she said, the lives in her head deserved to be on record. She'd carried them for 40 years, and she wasn't going to take all of them with her. She named some of them to me before she died, names and partial histories, fragments of lives she dreamed in that house on Sawmill Road. I wrote them down, sitting by her bed in the last weeks, in a notebook I still have. She gave me 11 names, some with full histories and some with fragments, and she was precise about what she remembered and what she was uncertain of, the way she was always precise. She said some of the lives she dreamed most completely and remembered most clearly were the early ones, the ones from the first generation of the house, and that those lives had a specific quality she struggled to describe, which was the quality of lives that were very close to the land, lives where the relationship between the person and the specific soil and water of that place was the center of everything, where the life and the land were not separate things. She said those lives had a weight in her head that the later ones didn't, as if depth in the land translated to depth in the dreaming. I looked up some of the names. I don't have access to comprehensive records, but Greenbrier County has reasonably good historical documentation going back to the early settlement period. And 4 of the 11 names my grandmother gave me appear in those records, attached to people who lived in that county in the periods consistent with what she described. The people existed. The names were real names of real people who'd been in Greenbrier County. I found 2 of them in the county deed records, with addresses that placed them on Sawmill Road in the relevant era. They'd lived in that house, the house that showed my grandmother their lives in her sleep, and their names were in her memory 50 years after she dreamed them. And those names are in the county records, and I sit with that. She named some of them to me before she died, names and partial histories, fragments of lives she dreamed in that house on Sawmill Road. I wrote them down. I have the list. I've looked up some of the names in the county historical records, and several of them appear, the names of people who lived in that county in the eras she described, which I cannot explain and have stopped trying to. I want to say something about what the house on Sawmill Road represents to me now, which is different from what it represented when my grandmother first refused to talk about it, and different again from what it was when she finally told me. Before she told me, the house was a mystery, an absence in the family's conversation, a place with a history too heavy to discuss. After she told me, it was a specific history, a specific house with a specific contents, manageable and named. But there's a third stage, the stage I'm in now, which is that the house on Sawmill Road is evidence of something I find important. It's evidence that ordinary human lives, lived with full attention and full love and full grief in a specific place, are not simply extinguished when those lives end. They persist in the structures they inhabited. They show themselves under the right conditions to the people with the receptivity to receive them. The woman who read by the fire, the farmer who carried water up from the spring, the family who went about the daily business of a Greenbrier County household across 100 years of settlement there in those walls. My grandmother received them. She carried them for 40 years, and she gave them to me. I've given them to a partial record in the county archives, and to this account. The transmission continues. The house on Sawmill Road is not haunted. That's the wrong word. It's occupied. It has been occupied continuously by generations of living people and then by the accumulated presence of those generations. And the accumulation does not subtract from the present living, but adds to it, and the person who sleeps in those walls sleeps in a fullness, a company that most people will never experience. The house on Sawmill Road still stands. I drove past it once after she died, and I want to describe that more fully because I left it sparse the first time. It was a Sunday in November, the first November after she passed, and I'd come to Lewisburg for a family gathering, and I had an hour before I needed to be at my cousin's house, and I made the decision, which I'd been putting off for years, to drive down Sawmill Road. The day was gray and cold, the mountain light going flat by mid-afternoon the way it does in November, and the road was quiet. I drove the length of it slowly until I came to the house. It was exactly as she described it, set back from the road, in the position of something that predates the road. White frame, older than the other houses on the road, but not aggressively old. Just the steady old of a structure that has been on its ground long enough to belong to it as much as the ground belongs to it. The house was in good condition. Someone was living there. I could see that from the road curtains in the windows. A car in the gravel, mail in the box. A living house with a living family in it. I sat in my car at the road for maybe 3 minutes. The house looked back at me, if houses can look back at you, with the quality that old houses have when they've been occupied long enough to have a personality. I thought about my grandmother in the upstairs bedroom, asleep, dreaming 30 or 40 lives a night. I thought about the lives in those walls, the layered lives, the ones whose names she gave me and the ones she didn't know or didn't tell. I thought about the people who were living in that house now, in those same rooms, sleeping in those walls, and whether they dreamed and whether they knew what they were sleeping in. I hope they're people it's easy with. I hope the house is quiet for them. I drove away and I haven't been back. I drove past it once after she died. I didn't go in. I didn't even stop the car. But I looked, the way you look at a place that holds something you've been told about for years, and it looked like what it is. An old house on a side road, set back from the road in the position of something that was there before the road, holding in its walls whatever it holds. I didn't feel anything particular looking at it. Maybe the house and I are not on those terms. Maybe it needed my grandmother's sleeping mind, her specific receptivity, and doesn't have anything to show me, and maybe it keeps what it holds for the right person at the right time. And I'm not that person. I've decided that's fine. The list of names is enough. They exist in writing now, outside the house, outside my grandmother's memory. I want to say something about what it's been like to carry those names and fragments since my grandmother gave them to me. Because carrying them is something I do every day, and I want to be honest about what that is. It's not a burden. I want to be clear about that. The lives my grandmother dreamed in that house, the fragments she gave me, the names I've partially verified, they're not a burden I carry reluctantly. They're more like company. Specific, quietly present company. The woman who read by the fire in the 1870s, whose full attention to her books left such a clear mark in the house that my grandmother could feel the warmth of it. 100 years later, she's a part of my daily landscape now. Not visible, not talking to me, nothing dramatic. Present the way that knowledge of a person makes them present, even when they're not in the room. I know her name and the shape of her daily life and the quality of her mind as my grandmother received it in those winter dreams. And that knowing is a form of company. My grandmother carried 30 or 40 of them for 40 years. That's a significant weight, and she managed it by keeping them at a distance, by not examining them too closely. And I think she did the right thing for herself, because she had her own full life to live. But in giving them to me, she gave me something she didn't have, which was the choice to engage with them more directly, to take what she'd received and do something with it, rather than just hold it. I've done what I can with what I have, which is to look up the names in the records and find the ones that are findable and write them down in a place outside of any single person's memory. They're documented now. They're on record somewhere. That was what she wanted, and I've done it, and it feels like the right thing to have done. The minimum of what was owed to people whose lives were held in the walls of a house for over 100 years. The list of names is enough. They exist in writing now, outside the house, outside my grandmother's memory. They were there. They were real. That's what she wanted me to know. Story 5. I'll keep this shorter than some, not because it's less significant, but because the significant thing about it is its simplicity. I'm a retired mail carrier, and I delivered mail in and around Abingdon, Virginia for 29 years. I'll keep this shorter than some, not because it's less significant, but because the significant thing about it is its simplicity. I want to say something about Abingdon before I say anything else. Abingdon is in Washington County, in the far southwest corner of Virginia, one of the oldest towns in the Appalachians. The first Virginia settlement west of the Blue Ridge, founded in 1778, built on a site the Cherokee called the Sapling Grove. Everything that has happened in the southwestern Appalachians, the settlement, the Cherokee removal, the Civil War campaigns, the railroad, the agricultural changes, the cultural changes, has passed through or near Abingdon, and the town has that quality of a place that has been at the center of things for a long time. The quality of accumulated significance. The Barter Theater, which has been operating there since the Depression, is the State Theater of Virginia, and it gives the town a cultural liveliness that some mountain towns don't have. But the liveliness sits on top of a depth of history that you feel most clearly on the side roads, away from the theater and the antique shops, where the old farmhouses stand on their ridges, and the land looks like it's been farmed since before memory. The side road where Mrs. H lived was one of those roads a couple of miles from the main town, the kind of road that connected properties rather than going anywhere in particular. And it had the quality of a road that has always been a side road, where the pace of things is slower and the present sits a little looser on the past. When you carry mail for 29 years in the same territory, you develop a relationship with every property on your route that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't done it. You're there every day, in all weather, at a consistent time, and you watch houses the way no one else watches houses. Let me tell you what a rural walking route in Washington County was like in the years I was doing it, because the physicality of it is part of the account. My route included several miles of walking, including the side road where Mrs. H's property was. And in all weather over 29 years, I walked it the summer heat when the road shimmered and the mailbox burned your hand. The fall when the leaves came down and made the walking slick. The winter when the road iced and you walked the gravel edge for traction. The spring mud that took your boots if you weren't careful. The properties on my route were my daily landscape, the thing I walked through most of my waking hours for 3 decades. And I noticed every change in them, the way you notice changes in a landscape you're in every day. The elm that came down in the storm, the new paint on the Henderson's barn, the year the Blackberry Spring property's yard went from tended to untended when the old widow who'd kept it died and the heir stopped maintaining it. Every property was a running narrative I followed without intending to. Mrs. H's property was the longest running and most consistent narrative on my whole route. Nothing about it changed. Nothing. Not the condition of the orchard, not the condition of the house, not the presence of the woman in it. 29 years of a narrative with no plot movement except the seasons turning and the same woman coming to the same box at the same time with the same specific attention. It was, in retrospect, the most stable thing in my professional life. When you carry mail for 29 years in the same territory, Abingdon is in Washington County, in the far southwest corner of the state, a town of about 8,000 people, one of the oldest towns in the Appalachians, the first Virginia settlement west of the Blue Ridge, built on a site that had been used by the Cherokee for centuries before that. It's a pretty town with old buildings and a vibrant arts community now, partly because of the Barter Theater, which is a professional theater that's been operating there since the Depression, and partly because the town has always had a mix of old families and people who came for a different kind of life. I'm one of the old families. My grandfather was born in Washington County, and so was his father, and so on back further than the records reliably go. When you carry mail for 29 years in the same territory, you develop a relationship with every property on your route that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't done it. You're there every day, in all weather, at a consistent time. And you watch houses the way no one else watches houses, not as a neighbor who sees them on weekends, or as a visitor who comes for occasions, but as a daily presence who notices every small change, every sign of a life being lived or not being lived, every subtle shift in the condition and the mood of a property. I can tell you things about properties on my old route that the people who've owned them for 30 years don't know, because I was there every day and they were not. There was one house on my route that I want to tell you about, and I want to describe it properly before I tell you about the woman, because the house and the woman are not separable. The house sat on a low rise with the apple orchard going down the slope behind it, and the property had the specific quality of a place that has been in continuous use for a very long time by people who paid attention to it. The orchard was old and well kept, and old, well-kept orchards in the Appalachians are not a given. They require consistent attention across generations. The pruning and the grafting and the management that keeps an orchard productive. And when you see one that's genuinely old and genuinely maintained, you're seeing the physical evidence of a long and careful relationship between a family and that particular piece of ground. The orchard was that kind of evidence. The house itself was not large, a frame house with a porch, painted white in the way of those houses. And the paint was not always fresh, but was always present. And the porch had the specific sag of a very old porch that has held its shape through decades of seasons and use. The property had the feeling of a place that has been loved, specifically and practically loved, in the way that the consistent small attentions of generation after generation add up to something the landscape holds. There was one house on my route that I want to tell you about, a white frame house on a side road about 2 miles east of town, set on a low rise with an apple orchard going down the slope behind it, a house that had been in the same family for multiple generations, and that was lived in for the entire 29 years of my route by the same woman. I'll call her Mrs. H. She was elderly when I started the route, late 70s, I guessed, and she was elderly when I retired 29 years later, which should be mathematically impossible, and which I noticed without resolving for years, because the alternative to acknowledging it was simpler, and the simpler thing was just to deliver her mail and not think too hard about the calendar. She was a pleasant woman, not effusive, not the type to come out and chat, but when our paths crossed, and on a walking route like mine, on a side road, they crossed fairly often. She was warm and direct, and remembered things I'd mentioned in passing on previous encounters. The kind of attentiveness that makes you feel seen in a way that casual acquaintance usually doesn't. She had a particular quality of presence, a stillness about her that wasn't aloofness, more like the stillness of someone who has been in one place for a very long time and has no anxiety about being anywhere else. She was simply there, in the way that some very old things are simply there, not waiting for anything and not going anywhere. The house itself was always in the same condition, not suspiciously perfect. It had the normal weathering and the normal small deteriorations that old houses have. The paint a little chalky, a porch board occasionally soft underfoot, the kind of maintenance that happens but not always right away. But it was always essentially the same, year after year, decade after decade, in a way that began to seem less like good maintenance and more like something else, something I couldn't name. About 10 years into my route, I mentioned Mrs. H to another carrier who'd retired from a neighboring route, a man who'd been in Washington County his whole life and knew his families going back several generations. I described the house and the orchard and the woman, and I described the calendar thing, not in a dramatic way, just as an observation I'd been carrying around. He looked at me for a moment, and then he said, "She's been there a long time." I said, "Yes, she certainly has." He said, "Longer than you think." I asked what he meant. He said his father had known that road in the 1950s, had driven it regularly, and that there had been an old woman in that house when his father was young and driving it, the same house on the same rise with the same orchard. He said the description had never changed: old woman, pleasant, remembered things. He said the families on that road had always just known she was there and had not asked questions because there were no questions to ask that had useful answers. I sat with that for several years, the comfortable knowledge that someone else knew, that it wasn't mine alone to carry. I didn't examine the knowledge too closely. I just delivered the mail and said good morning when we crossed paths, and she remembered the things I'd mentioned, and I was grateful for the being seen of it, which is not a small thing over 29 years. Some people spend their lives not being seen. Mrs. H saw me, clearly and specifically, and she was kind about what she saw. I asked one of the old-timers about the house, specifically about Mrs. H, about 10 years into my route. Not because anything was wrong, but because the calendar thing was nagging at me and I wanted a sensible explanation. The old-timer, a man who'd been in Abingdon his whole life and knew everything about Washington County, listened to my description and was quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd been getting mail at his house from Mrs. H for 50 years, that she wrote a card every Christmas and had for as long as he could remember. I said 50 years. She must have been very old when you first knew her. He said yes, she was old then too. He said it simply, without drama, the way people in old places sometimes acknowledge old things. And then he changed the subject and I let him. I delivered to that house for 29 years, and Mrs. H received her mail for 29 years with the warm directness and the specific attentiveness that she'd always had. And the house stood on its low rise above the apple orchard in its state of unchangedness. And I retired and someone else took the route, and I don't know who delivers to that house now or whether she's still there. I haven't driven down that road since I retired. There's part of me that wants to see if the house is as it was, to see if she'd still remember me, if our paths crossed, to look at the orchard in October one more time. And there's a larger part of me that understands something I didn't understand on my first day of the route, which is that she was good to that road in a way that I've spent 29 years trying to be, and that the road was changed by the being good to. Every property on a mail route is a relationship. Most of those relationships are transactional. The carrier delivers, the resident receives, the transaction completes. But some properties develop a different quality over years, a depth. And the depth comes from the same thing the orchard's consistency came from, which is long, careful attention. She gave that road 30-some years of long, careful attention before I arrived. I gave it 29. The driver who has it now is adding their own years. And the road accumulates all of it, the way roads accumulate everything, the weight of all the feet and all the attention, the daily practice of care. I think the road remembers being good to. I think the specific side road where Mrs. H's property sits, with the orchard going down the slope and the white frame house on the rise, is a road that has been well tended for a very long time by someone who understood that tending a road is its own form of devotion, and that the road is the better for it, and that when I walk it in my mind now, 7 years of retired, the quality of the memory is different from any other stretch of my old route, warmer, more complete, more present, as if the road is still carrying her, and me, and all the good care that went into it, and giving it back to whoever walks it now. There's a part of me that wants to see if the house is as it was, to see if she'd still remember me if our paths crossed. And there's another part that knows some things are better left in the state you last left them in. That going back to check would be asking for an answer to a question I'm not sure I want answered. Let me tell you one specific thing, she said, that I've thought about more than anything else in 29 years of deliveries. This was about 15 years in, a day when she'd come out to the box at the same time I was at it, which was unusual. And we exchanged a few words the way we did, and she asked about my daughter, who'd been sick the previous month, and she remembered the illness. And she asked if my daughter was fully recovered, and I said, yes, thank you for asking. And she said, she's going to be well. She has good roots. Just that simple and certain, the way she said most things. Good roots. And my daughter is now in her 30s and healthy and established in her life. And I've thought about those two words many times. Good roots. Said the way someone says a thing they know, rather than a thing they hope. She was kind to me for 29 years. She remembered the things I mentioned. I think that's enough. But I'll add one more thing, the last detail, the October one. In late October every year, the apple orchard behind the house was at its peak. The old mountain varieties ripening to red and yellow in the cool air. I walked past that orchard in October for 29 years, and it was always full, always exactly what an orchard should be. Not having a bad year or drought year, just consistent and full in October for 29 years, which is not how orchards work in my agricultural understanding. On the last day of my route, I stopped at the box one final time and she came out. And she said, "You're finishing." I said, "Yes." She looked at me with the specific attention she always had and she said, "You've been good to this road. Not good on it, good to it." I've thought about that distinction for the 7 years since I retired. You can be good on a road, you can do the job. You can also be good to a road, which is a different thing, which is about what you give to the ground you walk across decades, the attention and the care, and whether the ground receives it. She knew the difference. She'd been good to her road for longer than I'd been alive. Story 6. I'm going to tell you something that happened when I was 11 years old in the town of Wytheville, Virginia. And I want to tell it the way it happened, which means starting with my grandfather, because he's the center of it. Wytheville is the county seat of Wythe County in the Virginia Mountains, a crossroads town. And crossroads towns in Appalachia have a specific character that I think comes from being the place where routes converge, where the population is denser and more mixed than the surrounding hollows and ridges, and where the commercial and institutional life of a region concentrates. Wytheville has been a crossroads since the old Wilderness Road passed through it going west. And the town has that character of a place that has seen a lot of traffic across a long time, a lot of comings and goings, a lot of lives that passed through and lives that stayed. My family was on the staying side of that equation. One of the families that settled Wythe County in the early period and has been there since, the kind of family where you don't have to go back many generations before you're into the founding of the county itself. That kind of rootedness is its own inheritance. And one of the things it gives you is a particular relationship with the dead, who are your dead specifically, who are in the ground of your ground, and who are therefore, in some sense, still present in a way that the dead of a family with no specific place can't quite be. I'm going to tell you something that happened when I was 11 years old in the town of Wytheville, Virginia. And I want to tell it the way it happened, which means starting with my grandfather, because he's the center of it. My grandfather was born in Wythe County and spent his whole life there. He was a man of few words, but the words he used counted, and he had the specific kind of mountain intelligence that doesn't announce itself. I want to describe him a little more specifically because the specific qualities of the man are why the account is what it is. My grandfather had a reputation in Wythe County for keeping his word that I understood only in its full dimension after he was gone. Not just the ordinary reputation of a reliable person, a specific reputation, the kind that people refer to when they want to make a point about what keeping your word actually means. People would say, "He's good as Granddad," which I heard several times at the funeral, and which is the kind of epitaph that tells you something real about a person. He had the Wythe County farmer's relationship with commitment, which is a relationship that comes from living close to the land, where the commitments are literal and practical. You say you'll come and help with the harvest, and you come. Not because the harvest is metaphorical, but because the harvest won't wait and your neighbor needs you. You say you'll be there and you're there. That's the practice, accumulated across a life, that I think my grandfather was drawing on when he said what he said to my mother, when he told her he intended to check on the people he loved. He was a man of few words, but the words he used counted, and he had the specific kind of mountain intelligence that doesn't announce itself. The intelligence that comes from paying close attention to the world over a long time and drawing conclusions slowly and holding them carefully. He could read weather and could read people and could read land with an accuracy that seemed like intuition, but was actually just years of observation. He had opinions about things, strong ones, but he offered them only when asked, and sometimes not even then. And he kept certain kinds of knowledge to himself with the deliberate privacy of someone who'd learned that some knowledge doesn't improve situations by being shared. He died when I was 11 in October, and his death was the first significant loss of my life. And the grief of it had that specific quality that childhood grief has, which is that it's total, without the cushioning of experience or perspective. And it was the first time I'd understood in my body, rather than my head, what it meant that a person was gone and wasn't coming back. The night after his funeral, I was sleeping in the upstairs bedroom of my grandmother's house. I want to describe the night in more detail, because the detail is part of what made it real to me and has kept it real for 50 years. The funeral had been a full-day thing, the mountain way, with the visitation in the morning and the service in the afternoon and the gathering at my grandmother's house in the evening, where people came and brought food and sat and talked. And by 10 o'clock, I was exhausted in the specific way that grief and the performance of grief for hours combine to exhaust you. My body done and my mind still full, too many faces and voices and expressions of condolence still circling. My cousins had gone to their parents, and I was in the upstairs bedroom, the small room at the back of the house with the single window looking toward the dark yard and the ridge beyond. And the house was finally quiet, and I lay in the dark and listened to the quiet and thought about my grandfather, the way you think about someone immediately after they're gone, turning them over in your mind as if you need to memorize them before memory fades. I'd been lying there for probably an hour, not asleep and not quite awake, in that state between where the images come loose from your control, and I was thinking about his hands, which were a carpenter's hands, large and calloused with the specific wear of someone who'd worked with wood his whole life. And the hands were vivid in my mind, more vivid than anything I had thought about in the hour. And then I was awake completely, all at once. Not startled, just awake, with the room different from how it had been. The night after his funeral, I was sleeping in the upstairs bedroom of my grandmother's house, which was in town proper, a wood frame house on a quiet street. And I woke in the middle of the night from a dream I couldn't remember to the certainty that there was someone in the room with me. Not the anxious certainty of being afraid in the dark. I want to be clear about that distinction. A different certainty, the kind that arrives without anxiety. The simple fact of a presence in the room the way there's a fact of furniture in the room. I lay still and let my eyes adjust, and I could see in the dark, which was not complete dark, because there was a streetlight outside, the shape of my grandfather sitting in the chair by the window. I want to describe what I mean by shape, because I know what you're thinking. It was not a vague outline or a shape that could have been clothes hung over the chair, or a trick of the light. It was my grandfather in his chair, in the way that his chair had always been his chair at home. And this was not his chair, but he had made it his for the moment. He was sitting the way he sat, with his hands on his knees, and he was looking at me. I was not frightened. I'm going to say that again because I know how it sounds. I was 11 years old. It was the night after my grandfather's funeral. And I woke up to find him in the chair by the window, and I was not frightened. And I want to explain why, because I think the why is important. My relationship with my grandfather had been, from my earliest memory, a relationship of being known. not known in the way parents know you with the anxiety of responsibility, but known in the way a very patient and attentive person knows you when they've watched you carefully over years and drawn their conclusions slowly. He knew what I could do and what I couldn't yet do. He knew what I was afraid of. He knew what I was proud of and what I was embarrassed by. He knew my particular flavor of grief, and he'd been watching it since the death was announced. And he'd chosen to sit with it that night, because that's what you do when you know someone and they need sitting with. When I woke up to find him in the chair, what I felt was not supernatural dread. What I felt was my grandfather. The specific quality of his presence, which I'd known my whole life, was in that room. And everything else, the impossibility of it. The fact of his death the day before, the rational case for it not being real, everything else was secondary to the direct experience of his presence. I recognized him before I made sense of the situation, and the recognition was not frightening. It was grief and love and relief. The specific relief of having someone you've lost be present for a moment. And I lay in that bed and let myself be with him, the same way he'd come to be with me. I was not frightened. I'm going to say that again because I know how it sounds. I was 11 years old. It was the night after my grandfather's funeral, and I woke up to find him in the chair by the window, and I was not frightened. What I was still. I lay in the bed, and I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I had the absolute clear understanding, the way you understand things in certain states between sleep and waking, that he had come to make sure I was all right, that the specific thing he was there for was the specific thing that had been worrying him, which was me and my grief, and that he was going to sit there in the chair until he was satisfied I was all right. He didn't speak. I didn't speak. I don't think either of us needed to. He sat in the chair and I lay in the bed, and we were in the room together for what I think was about an hour. Though time in that state has its own scale, and at some point I fell back asleep, and when I woke in the morning, the chair was just the chair. And I was alone in the room, and the grief was still there, but it was different. It had the quality that grief has after you've been held, after someone who loves you has sat with you in it. Not resolved, not gone, but accompanied. He'd sat with me in it. I've told this account before, to my mother and to a few others over the years, and the response I get most often is an explanation, a grief dream, a hallucination produced by loss, the mind's way of processing something it can't accept. And I've sat with those explanations for decades, and I don't reject them entirely, but I find them insufficient for one specific reason. My grandfather was a man who paid close attention to the world and drew conclusions slowly and held his knowledge carefully. And the thing he was known for, the thing everyone who knew him knew, was that he honored his commitments. He'd told my mother, his daughter, on several occasions over the years that if it was possible to check on the people he loved after he was gone, he intended to do it, that it would be his first priority if there was any capacity for priority. And she'd taken it as the kind of thing people say, and I took it as something else. I took it as a man informing his family of his intention in the only language available to him, which was the language of plain statement, and then following through on it the first night he could. I want to tell you more about what my grandfather actually said, the thing he'd said on several occasions about what he intended, because I've come to think the saying of it was as important as the doing of it. My mother told me, years after the night I'm describing, that my grandfather had talked about it in a specific way more than once. Not vaguely, but specifically, not, I hope to check on you all, but I intend to, this is my plan, this is what I'll do first. She said he'd said it in the context of aging, of being aware that he wasn't going to be there much longer, and that he'd said it with the same practical directness with which he approached every other matter of planning and preparation. He said he'd spend his life taking care of the people he loved, and he intended to keep doing that, and that dying wasn't going to interrupt it if there was any capacity in the state after to prevent the interruption. She said she'd taken it as an old man being sentimental about mortality, and hadn't thought much more about it until I told her about the chair. And when I told her about the chair, my mother didn't cry. She nodded. She said, "Of course he did." She said it with the matter-of-fact recognition of a woman who'd known her father her whole life, and this was entirely consistent with who he was. Of course he did. He said he would, and he did. He was a man who kept his word, and apparently death didn't change that. Which is the most my grandfather thing I can imagine. I'm 61 years old. I've thought about that chair and that night for 50 years. And I want to tell you what 50 years of thinking has produced, which is simpler than you might expect. And I want to add one thing first about what the chair was. The chair was his, not my grandmother's chair, his. He'd brought it to that house when they moved in, and it had been in that upstairs room for as long as I could remember, always in the same position by the window, and it was the chair he sat in when he came up to read or to be quiet. The chair that was specifically his, in the way that certain pieces of furniture in old households are specifically one person's without anyone saying it. When I woke that night and saw him in the chair, he was in his chair, the same chair in the same position where he had always been when he was in that room. He came to the chair he knew because the chair was where he'd always been when he needed to be quietly present in that room. There was no dramatic appearing in a strange place. He was in his chair where he always sat. I think about that specific detail, the chair, his chair, the absolute consistency of it. And I find it more convincing than if he'd appeared somewhere theatrical. He came to the place he knew and sat the way he sat, with his hands on his knees, and he was there in the same way he'd always been there. I'm 61 years old. I've thought about that chair and that night for 50 years. And I want to tell you what 50 years of thinking has produced, which is simpler than you might expect. What it's produced is the understanding that love and commitment are not separate from whatever it is that continues after a person is gone. They're the same thing. They're the mechanism. My grandfather was a man who loved his people and kept his commitments. And the thing I experienced in that chair the night after his funeral was not something supernatural added to who he was. It was who he was, persisting. The love and the commitment didn't stop when he did. There, what continued. And what continued expressed itself in the way the man had always expressed himself, which was by being present for the people he loved when they needed him to be, by showing up, by sitting in the chair. He was a practical man, and his love was practical, and his persistence after death was practical. He came to check on me because he said he would. 50 years of thinking about this has made me less interested in the question of what happened that night. Whether it was real in the conventional sense, whether there's a mechanism for it, what the physics might be, and more interested in the thing it demonstrated, which is that the love a person carries and the commitments they make are not properties of the body that end when the body ends. They have their own persistence. They find their expressions. And I think the expression they find is usually not dramatic, usually not a full apparition in a moonlit bedroom, but quieter, a presence felt in a room, an inexplicable warmth at the right moment, the specific quality of someone's attention landing on you from nowhere, the way my grandfather's attention had always landed on me, precisely and without fuss, for exactly as long as it was needed. I'm 61 years old. I've thought about that chair and that night for 50 years. I want to tell you about the one time I went back inside my grandmother's house as an adult, which was about 20 years after that night, when she died and the house was being prepared for sale. I went with my mother to help clear things out, which is the kind of thing adult children do. The going through of a life that happens after a death, and we spent a full day in the house sorting and packing and saying goodbye to the accumulation of decades. In the late afternoon when we were nearly done, I went upstairs to the room where I'd slept the night after the funeral, the room with the chair by the window. The chair was still there, the same chair in the same position by the window, and the afternoon light was coming through the curtains, the way it comes through curtains in old rooms with old windows. And the room smelled like my grandmother's house smelled, a specific smell of old wood and the particular soap she'd used, and the specific air of a house that's been lived in by the same person for 50 years. I stood in the doorway of that room for a long time. I didn't go in. I looked at the chair and I looked at the window and I thought about the night of the funeral. When I was 11 and had woken up to find my grandfather sitting there. And I thought about what my mother had said. Of course he did. And I said out loud to the room, to whoever might be paying attention, "Thank you." Just that. And then I pulled the door closed and I went back downstairs. I've lived in Wytheville my whole adult life, moved into a house 6 blocks from my grandmother's old house. And when I drive past her house, which I still do sometimes, I think about the chair by the window in the upstairs bedroom. I think about him in it, sitting with his hands on his knees, making good on what he'd said he'd do. I think about what it means that he said it and then did it, that even in whatever state comes after it, his first thought was his commitments to his people, and his first act was to honor them. He was that kind of man. It didn't surprise me then, and it doesn't surprise me now. Story 7. I want to preface this by saying that I'm a person who believes in practical explanations, that I work as a county coroner in a small county in eastern Tennessee and have for 18 years, and that my entire professional life consists of making sense of deaths in a factual and documented way, and that this experience is the only thing in my professional or personal life that I have not been able to make sense of in any way that satisfies me. And I've been working at it for 11 years. Let me describe the county and the setting. The Cumberland Plateau runs across the eastern edge of Tennessee, and it's a plateau country, the specific topography of a high flat surface cut by deep river gorges, different from the ridge and valley pattern of the main Appalachian chain. The plateau communities are old and isolated in their own specific way, the gorges serving as boundaries that made each community turn inward, and the communities have that quality of long inward turning. The deep local knowledge and the deep local history that comes from generations paying close attention to a small territory. The coal and timber came through and went, the same as everywhere else, and what's left is the people and the land and the history. In 18 years of coroner work, I've been inside a great many houses in this county, and I know its lives and deaths intimately, which is the most complete intimacy there is. The town I'm going to talk about, I'll call by its county rather than its name, because there are only 3 coroners in this county at any given time, and I'd like to maintain some anonymity. It's a small county in the Cumberland Plateau region, coal and timber history, a few small towns, and the kind of community where everybody is related to everybody by blood or marriage or both within 2 or 3 removes. I've lived here my whole life, attended the same small school my father attended, and when I say I know this county, I mean I know its soil and its seasons and its families and a significant proportion of its deaths, which gives you a particular kind of knowledge of a place, the kind that most people avoid because they'd rather not think about the eventual end of the people they know. 11 years ago, I was called out to a death at a house on a county road about 8 miles from town. Old house on a property that had been in the same family for generations, and the death was straightforward. An elderly woman who'd been in declining health, found by a neighbor who'd come to check on her. I want to describe the house, the setting, because the physical context shapes everything that followed. The house was on a ridge, not the top of the ridge, but partway up it, in the position that old mountain houses often occupy, high enough to see the road and the hollow below. Sheltered enough from the worst of the ridge-top weather. The property had a kitchen garden at the south side, gone to winter dead stalks in November, and a woodpile that had been carefully stacked and was still well stocked, which told me the woman had been active into the recent past, that someone had been tending the property consistently. The house itself was small and neat and old, the kind of house that has been maintained through decades of careful small repairs rather than any major renovation. and it had the quality that I've come to associate with houses that have had one person in them for a very long time. A specificity, a personality in the physical space, everything arranged according to a logic that belongs entirely to the person who has been there. Inside, the house was clean and orderly and organized in the particular way of a person who lived alone and had worked out their own system over decades. The kitchen was functional and personal specific hooks for specific tools, the bowl in the specific place it had always been in. The evidence of a long, considered, practiced routine. I've been in a lot of houses in this county as part of this work, and the ones that have been occupied by the same person for a very long time have this quality of having been shaped into a specific form. The way water shapes stone, the person and the house working on each other until the house is exactly theirs. This woman had been in her house long enough that the house was specifically and completely hers. I was called out to a death at a house on a county road about 8 miles from town. Old house on a property that had been in the same family for generations, and the death was straightforward. An elderly woman who'd been in declining health, found by a neighbor who'd come to check on her. Unattended, but not unexpected, the kind of call I get regularly, nothing complicated. I did the preliminary examination and released the body to the funeral home, and I was going through the house room by room to document the conditions and the way my job requires, the presence of medications and their dates, the overall state of the property, the basic assessment that goes into a death report. Standard work, the kind I've done hundreds of times. In the back bedroom, the one that had clearly been the deceased's room, on the nightstand beside the bed, I found a journal. I want to be precise about what kind of journal it was, because this matters. Not a personal diary, not the kind where someone writes about their feelings and their day. It was a record book, the kind of composition notebook you'd use for accounts or inventory. And when I opened it, it contained dates and times in 2 columns. What appeared to be observations of some kind, going back years. The entries were in a careful hand, consistent over the years. Same handwriting across what looked like decades. The dates on the early entries were more than 30 years back. I'm going to describe some of the entries, not in full because I didn't copy them, but I remember them clearly. Each entry had a date, a time, and then a brief notation. The notations were things like window 3 times between 2 and 3, or kitchen by the stove, evening, or the hallway before dawn, going toward the back. The notations were consistent across 30 years. The same locations, the same approximate times, the same brief matter-of-fact description. The last entry was 2 days before the woman died. I stood in that back bedroom with the journal open, and I read through several pages, not all of it. The journal was thick, and the entries were consistent, and I had a professional task to complete, but enough to understand what I was holding. And I want to describe what it felt like to read those entries, because the feeling is the important part that I haven't conveyed yet. I'm a man who reads a lot of documentation, death certificates, incident reports, medical records, the administrative language of endings. I'm accustomed to the feeling of reading records that contain the compressed residue of a life that reduce complex human experience to dates and checkboxes and brief notations. What I felt reading the journal was the opposite of that feeling. The notations were brief and they were consistent across decades, and they were in the same accounting register as the household accounts, but they were alive in a way that documentation is usually not. They were alive because they were the product of a decision made and sustained over 30 years. The decision to notice and record, and the quality of that noticing came through the brevity rather than being obscured by it. A woman had paid 30 years of patient attention to the life of her house, had recorded what that life did on specific days at specific hours in specific rooms, had kept the record as seriously as she kept the accounts, and the record was in my hands now, and I was the first stranger to read it. I was the first stranger to read it. That thought arrived while I was standing there, and it's one I've held for 11 years. She'd kept that journal privately in her bedroom for 30 years, and no one outside the house had read it while she was alive. And now I was reading it, and I was reading it because she was dead. And the intimacy of that, the specific quality of posthumous intimacy that coroner work produces, was present in a way I don't think I've felt with any other document. I stood in that back bedroom with the journal open, and I realized I was reading a 30-year record of a woman documenting the activity in her own house. Not once or twice, not a few incidents, 30 years of regular, consistent entries, as routine as an account book, as practical as a weather log. She'd been noting it the way you note weather, the way you note the date, the apple tree blooms, or the date the creek floods, as information about the place she lived in. Not with fear, not with urgency, just with the methodical attention of someone who decided that the thing happening in her house was real and worth documenting, even if she didn't know what to do with the documentation. I put the journal down on the nightstand where I'd found it. I completed my report. I listed the journal in my inventory of the room's contents, which is what I'm required to do. The family collected the estate's contents. I looked up the family a few months later, not officially, just the kind of thing you do in a small county when something stays with you, and I found the next of kin, a niece who'd driven in from another state for the death call in the estate business. I talked to her at the post office, which is the kind of place you have accidental conversations in a small county, and I asked carefully what had happened to some of the personal items in the house, and she said she'd packed most of it in boxes to sort later. I described the journal without calling it a journal. I said I'd found a record book in the bedroom nightstand that seemed to be a long-term account of some kind, and asked if she'd found it when she packed. She said yes. I asked if she'd looked at it. She said she'd opened it, seen that it was some kind of notes going back years, and set it aside to look at more carefully later. And then she said something that I've held on to. She said she was always writing things down. She said her aunt had been a woman who believed in keeping records, that it was a family trait, that several of the women in the family going back had kept records of their houses and their land and their daily lives. And she said it in the tone of someone describing a family eccentricity that they found endearing rather than strange. She said sometimes she thought the women in her family kept records because they didn't trust that the ordinary things would be remembered unless someone wrote them down, and that her aunt had just taken it further than most. I said, "Did you know what she was recording?" There was a pause, and then she said, "I have an idea," and she didn't elaborate, and I didn't push because I was at the post office, and she was dealing with an aunt's death, and there are appropriate registers for conversations, and that wasn't the right one. But I have an idea. She knew. On some level, for some period of time, she'd had some knowledge of what was in the house with her aunt and what the entries in the journal referred to, and she'd filed it the way families file those things, in the folder labeled Aunt's Eccentricities, taking it further than most. The family collected the estate's contents, and I don't know what became of the journal specifically. I think about it often. Let me describe the physical journal more, because I've thought about it as a physical object a great deal, and the physical object has its own significance. It was a standard composition notebook, the black and white marbled cover kind, except she'd worn through several of them over 30 years, and redone the accounting in what appeared to be the same hand across different notebooks that she'd combined somehow into the single book I say appeared to be, because by the time I saw it, the notebooks had been rebound by her or by someone into a single volume, held together by cloth tape down the spine. A single thick book of 30 years of entries. The rebound quality told me she'd considered it a single document, that it had been assembled rather than accumulated, that at some point she'd decided the record should be one thing, rather than many things, and had done the work to make it one thing. That decision, to make it a single coherent document rather than a stack of worn notebooks, is a choice that implies a relationship to the material. a considered relationship, a person who'd looked at what she'd made and decided it deserved a proper form. The handwriting was consistent across the decades, but showed the natural changes of a person aging firmer in the early entries, smaller in the middle years, larger and slightly shakier in the last few years before her death. The entries from the last 6 months were in a different pen, a felt tip rather than the ballpoint that most of the journal was in, and I thought about why the pen changed, and whether it was because her grip had changed, because certain tools become easier or harder as hands age. And I thought about an old woman in her back bedroom in the mountains, writing in her composition book with a felt tip pen because it slid more easily, recording the date and the time and the room the way she always had. What stays with me is not the journal itself, which is strange enough. What stays with me is the consistency of it. 30 years of entries, 2 columns, dates, and descriptions. Not obsessive record keeping, not the output of a frightened mind. Cataloging threats, the entries were too calm and too routine for that. She was keeping a record of her house's activity, the way a farmer keeps a record of the land's activity as information about the place, because information about the place had practical value, because knowing when the kitchen was active and when the hallway was in use was the same kind of useful knowledge as knowing when the creek was likely to flood. She'd incorporated it into the practical management of her life and her house, the way you incorporate any regular feature of your environment. And she'd kept the record for 30 years, and the last entry was 2 days before she died. And the entry was brief and calm, and noted the time and the location, and moved on. I want to say something about the 30-year practice before I say what I've concluded, because the practice is the heart of the account. 30 years of keeping any record is an act of faith in the value of the record, an ongoing commitment to the belief that writing something down matters. I know something about this from my own work because my entire practice is the documentation of deaths, the formal assertion that a person died, and that the fact of their dying is acknowledged. The death certificate, the report, the cause and manner. These are forms of acknowledgement, of saying this happened. This person died. It is recorded. I've signed thousands of them, and I believe in them. The woman who kept that journal for 30 years was doing something analogous. She had a house that was active in ways that nobody formally acknowledged, and she was keeping the record herself because she believed the record mattered, because she believed the activity in her house was real, and that real things deserve documentation. She kept it with the same discipline she kept her accounts, with the practical daily commitment of a person who understands that keeping records is how you honor what's real. She documented the activity in her house for 30 years the way I document deaths, because the documented thing has more reality than the undocumented thing, because she believed what was in her house deserved the record, and the last entry was 2 days before she died. And it was as calm as every other entry, and she put the journal back on the nightstand, and she died, and the record was complete. I think about what it means to live in a house for 30 years and keep that record. I think about the steadiness it required, the particular kind of everyday courage that isn't dramatic, that doesn't announce itself, that just picks up the pen and writes the date and the time and puts the book back on the nightstand and goes to sleep. I don't know what was moving in that house. I don't know what she heard or saw in the kitchen by the stove or in the hallway before dawn. I know she documented it for 30 years, and she was not broken by it. And she kept her house, and she died in her own bed. And her last entry was 2 days before the end, and it was as calm as every other entry. That's the whole of what I have, and I've decided it's enough. But I want to add one final thing, which is what I do now every November in the week before Thanksgiving. I drive out to that county road, to the ridge where the house was, and I park at the road and I stand there for a few minutes. The house is gone now, the estate resolved eventually, the property changed hands, the structure was eventually demolished, and the land is just land now. A ridge in an eastern Tennessee county unremarkable from the road. But I stand there anyway. I've been doing it for 8 of the 11 years since the death call. I don't do anything ceremonial. I just stand at the road and I think about the woman with her composition book and her felt-tip pen in the back bedroom. And I think about 30 years of entries in 2 columns. And I think about the last entry 2 days before she died, as calm as every other entry. And I think she kept the record. The record was kept. Whatever was in that house was documented carefully for 30 years by the person who lived alongside it. And then the documentation passed through my hands, and now it's in this account. And the record continues to be kept. I think that's what she would have wanted, the continuation of the record beyond any single keeper, the documented thing persisting outside any individual memory. I stand there for a few minutes every November, and then I drive home. That's the whole of what I have, and I've decided it's enough. We're about halfway through tonight. If these accounts have been good company, do me the favor of leaving a comment. Before you close out, it helps the channel show up for people who'd appreciate it. And subscribe if you haven't. Back to the mountain towns. A few left, and they're strong ones. Story 8. This is going to be a long one because the context takes some time, and without the context, it doesn't hold together. I'll try to be efficient. I'm a structural engineer, and I work mostly on historic building preservation. I've been doing it for 22 years, and I've worked on buildings all over the Appalachians. And I have a professional relationship with old structures that I describe as a combination of deep affection and hard-headed practicality. Let me describe Floyd County before I describe the building, because the character of the place shapes the account. Floyd County is in the Blue Ridge of southwestern Virginia, and it has a specific reputation in the region that's somewhat at odds with its actual history. People know it now for its Friday night jamboree and its arts community and its progressive rural character. Its reputation as an unusual mountain county, with an unusual mix of old families and new arrivals. But Floyd County is also a very old mountain county, and the old part of it has a depth and a darkness that sits underneath the Friday night jamboree, the way the Blue Ridge granite sits under the soil. The old part of Floyd County knows things that the county's current reputation doesn't advertise, and some of those things are in the oral traditions of the families who've been there since the beginning, and some of them are in the buildings. Old buildings in mountain counties hold history in a way that's different from the way they hold it in cities or in places with more documented records. In cities, there are newspapers and court records and extensive institutional documentation. In mountain counties, especially in the eras before good road access, before the county seat was fully connected to the regional infrastructure, a lot of what happened in local oral tradition rather than in any written record. And the oral tradition is not complete. It selects, it forgets, it encodes things in ways that require context to decode. What ended up not in the oral tradition and not in the records sometimes ended up only in the buildings. The buildings are sometimes the last record. I've spent 22 years working with those records, and I have a respect for what they contain that goes beyond the structural and into something I can't put in a professional report. I was hired to assess a building that had been donated to a local historic preservation organization, with the intention of restoring it for community use. I've been doing it for 22 years, and I've worked on buildings all over the Appalachians, old courthouses and churches and mills and houses, and I have a professional relationship with old structures that I describe as a combination of deep affection and hard-headed practicality. I love old buildings. I also know exactly how they fail and in what sequence and for what reasons. And my job is knowing the difference between a building that can be saved and one that can't, and doing the engineering to save the ones that can. I'm not sentimental about structures in the way that non-engineers sometimes are. I'm clinical about them. I've worked on probably 300 buildings over 22 years, and there's one of them I want to tell you about. All located as being in a small town in Floyd County of Virginia, without naming the specific building. because the building is now in active use, and I'd rather not cause problems for the people who use it. Floyd County is in the Blue Ridge of southwestern Virginia, a county known now for its music and arts community and its progressive rural character. But it's also a very old mountain country, with the long history of settlement and subsistence and isolation and all the things that come with that. And there are parts of Floyd County where the old history sits very close to the surface. I was hired to assess a building that had been donated to a local historic preservation organization with the intention of restoring it for community use. The building was late 19th century construction, a commercial building of the kind that served mountain towns in that era, a general supply type operation. It had been through several uses and several owners over the decades and had been vacant for the last 15 years. And 15 years of vacancy in a mountain climate is not kind to old buildings. I went out on a Tuesday in November to do the initial assessment solo, which is standard for a first look. I want to describe the condition of the building without the strangeness first, because the condition is relevant. The structure itself was in surprisingly good shape, the foundation solid, the framing sound. The roof failing, but not yet failed. Better than most buildings after 15 years of vacancy in that climate. Whoever had built it to last, and it had lasted. The interior was the typical time capsule quality of long vacant old buildings. Everything left where it was when the last occupant left. The specific quality of interrupted use that I find both fascinating and melancholy in my work. Old shelving, old fixtures, accumulated sediment of decades of business. The kind of interior that tells you everything about the place's history if you know how to read it. I was in the building for about 2 hours before anything unusual happened, and in those 2 hours, it was just a building. I measured and photographed and made notes and assessed the structural elements with the methodical process of my work. And the building was silent around me, and I was not aware of anything except the building's physical condition. Then I went to the basement. The basement was accessed by a door in the back of the ground floor, a narrow door that opened onto wooden stairs. And the basement was half below grade on the front side and fully below grade on the back, as was common in buildings built into a slope. I went down with my flashlight and my measuring tape, and I started working. The basement was not in as good condition as the floor above, which was expected. More moisture, more deterioration, the foundation needing more attention. I was assessing the rear wall when I became aware of something I want to describe carefully, because the describing of it is the only way I can make it make sense to someone who hasn't had the experience. The basement felt occupied, not by a person present with me, not by an animal, not by any specific detectable thing, the way a room feels when someone has just left it or is about to enter it, or when there's someone in an adjacent room and the space is adjusted to that presence even though the presence isn't directly visible. I know the phrase doesn't mean anything physically. I know there's no measurable quality of a room that registers recent or anticipated occupation, and yet if you felt it, you know what I mean. And I felt it in many buildings over 22 years, and I've always had an explanation for it. Moisture or air movement or the particular acoustics of a space until that basement. I stood at the rear wall and I let myself feel the room. This is something I learned to do over years of working in old buildings, to be still for a moment and let the building communicate what it's communicating before I impose my own assessment on it. And the buildings I work on communicate physical things, drafts, deflections, sounds of settling and stress. But this basement was communicating something that was not physical, and which I am even now unable to categorize properly. There were people in that basement who were not there. That's the only way I can say it, and I know how it sounds from an engineer. I was alone in that basement, and there were people in it. Not visible, not audible, not producing any sensory input I can measure. Present the way that absorbed heat is present in a stone wall, the way that a 100-year groove in a wooden floor is. Present the record of occupancy. the physical evidence of lives lived in a space. Except this was not physical evidence. This was the occupancy itself, and the occupancy was ongoing. I finished my assessment. I did my job. I went back upstairs and wrote my notes, and they were accurate technical notes about foundation conditions and framing members and moisture infiltration. And they did not include anything about what I'd felt in the basement, because engineering reports don't have a category for that. I talked to the director of the Historical Preservation Organization when I handed in my report, and I mentioned the basement specifically. I said the basement had a quality that I wanted to note informally outside the report, and I tried to describe what I've described to you. She listened without expression, and when I finished, she said she'd heard that from the other preservationist who'd done work on the building before, who had said something similar about the basement. I asked her what she thought accounted for it, and she said the building had been used for things during the early years of the county that weren't recorded in any formal way, but that several families in the county had oral history about, and that those uses had been significant enough and distressing enough that they'd left the kind of mark she'd come to think of as permanent. She said it the way people say things they've come to accept about the places they work on, not dramatically, with the flat matter-of-factness of institutional knowledge. She said significant enough and distressing enough. And then, because she was deciding whether to say more, she said a little more. She said the families in the county whose oral histories contained references to the building were not the old money families, not the courthouse families, not the families whose ancestors appear in the documented records of the county. She said they were the families whose ancestors appear in other ways in the county's history, in the gaps in the records, in the things that are not documented and are not fully described even in the oral tradition. Because the oral tradition has its own protections, its own ways of encoding what it needs to encode in forms that require the right decoder. She said she'd been working in historic preservation in that county for 15 years, and she'd learned to read some of those encodings, not all of them, not the deepest ones, but enough to know what the word distressing was carrying without her having to specify it. I've thought about what she meant for a long time. I've thought about what kinds of things happen in a commercial building in a rural mountain county in the late 19th century that go into family oral histories rather than county records, that are significant enough and distressing enough to leave the kind of presence I felt in that basement. And I've arrived at some understandings that I won't put in this account because they belong to the history of specific families in a specific county, and it's not mine to put on record. What I'll say is that what I felt in that basement was not simply the ambient presence of accumulated lives in an old building, the quality that all genuinely old buildings have. It was the presence of something specific that had happened in that space. Something that the people it happened to and the people who witnessed it could not fully speak of and could not fully leave. She said it the way people say things they've come to accept about the places they work on, not dramatically, with the flat matter-of-factness of institutional knowledge. She said significant enough and distressing enough. I didn't press her on what that meant. I've thought about it for years. I've thought about the basement and the quality of presence in it, and the word distressing and the knowledge that something happened in that building that was significant enough to be in the oral histories of families in the county, but not in any written record. I've thought about what kinds of things those are, what kinds of events are held in families, but not in documents in Appalachian Mountain counties in the late 19th century. I've thought about those things, and I've thought about the basement. The restoration work on the building proceeded, and I oversaw parts of it, and I want to tell you something about what came after the restoration, which is the part of the account I have least information about, but which seems important to include. The building was put into use by the local preservation organization for community events and meetings, which is what it was donated for, and by all of accounts I've heard it has served that purpose well. It's a good building now that it's been properly stabilized and the roof is sound and the moisture intrusion is controlled, and it has the quality that old restored buildings have when the restoration has been done well. The quality of a building that's glad to be back in use. I've noticed that quality in other buildings I've worked on, and it's real. I'm not being fanciful. There's a quality that a well-built old building has when it's been brought back from vacancy into use. A responsiveness to being occupied again, a settling in. I've been back to the building twice since the restoration was complete. Both times were professional visits, project reviews, and both times I went to the basement. The basement is used for storage now. The community organization's extra chairs and tables and the folding kind of equipment that community organizations accumulate. It's an ordinary basement in regular use. And the quality of presence I'd felt on the first visit, the profound occupiedness of it, was still there, but it was different. I said this before, and I want to be more specific now about how. It felt less compressed, as if the regular use of the building above, the regular presence of people meeting and gathering and using the space, had released something in the basement from the specific tension of a significant thing held in an empty space. The thing was still there. The space was still occupied by something that was not the folding chairs and the extra tables. But the occupation felt different in a community building in regular use than it had in a vacant building, and I find that significant. I find it significant that regular, decent human use of a building can change the quality of what the building holds, can give it, perhaps, a different context in which to be held. The restoration work on the building proceeded, and I oversaw parts of it. I went back to that basement many times, and I wanted to describe how the experience changed across multiple visits, because the change is significant. The first several visits back were identical to the first, the same quality of occupiedness, the same presence without physical form, the same sense of something that had been in that space and not left. My professional relationship with the basement was to assess its structural condition and oversee the remediation work. And I did that work carefully and thoroughly. And the work went well. And at every visit, the basement was what the basement had been. I adapted to it the way you adapt to the conditions of a work environment, noting it and proceeding, getting on with the job. What changed was gradual and took about 6 months of regular visits to become clear. The quality of the presence in the basement was becoming, I want to say, different in a way I find hard to describe precisely. Not diminished, not resolved different. It had begun to feel over the course of months of work in the building less like a trapped or unresolved thing, and more like something that had been seen. I had been going into that space regularly, doing good work in it, treating it with the respect I treat all old buildings. And the presence had become accustomed to me is not quite right. Acknowledged is closer. Two things sharing a space and aware of each other, neither of which requires the other to leave. By the time the restoration work was finished and the building was ready for its new use, the basement felt different from the first visit. Not in what it held, but in the quality of the holding. Less tense, less pressed, as if the long-standing tension of something significant held in a space and never acknowledged had been, by the fact of my repeated acknowledgement, released even slightly, not healed, acknowledged. I went back to that basement many times. It was always the same, not frightening, not hostile, just occupied in the way I've described. The presence of lives that had been in that space in ways that didn't allow for easy leaving. I did good work on that building. I think it should stand for another 100 years. And I want to tell you what I said to the building, specifically to the basement, on my last professional visit, which was the final inspection before the organization took full occupancy. I did the inspection alone, which is standard. I went through the upper floors first, checking the work, confirming the remediation had held, noting the things that would need attention in 5 years and the things that were solid for decades. And then I went to the basement. I stood in the doorway for a moment, the way I'd stood in the doorway on that first visit, and I let the room be what it was, which was what it had always been. Occupied in the way I've described, the specific weight of something significant held in the space, but different now, less tense, as I've said, as if the acknowledgement of years of work in the building above had released some of the compression. I walked to the center of the basement. I stood there in the unfinished light, the bare bulb the restoration had installed, and I said out loud to the basement, I know something happened here. I don't know what it was. What I know is that the people it happened to were real, and what happened to them was significant enough to be in the oral histories of families in this county for over 100 years. I said this building is going to be used by the community that surrounds it, for meetings and gatherings and the ordinary business of people living together, and I hope that use helps. I said those things plainly, and then I stood there for a moment in the silence. And then I finished the inspection and I went home. I don't know if saying it helped. I don't know if it was heard or received in any meaningful sense. I know it seemed like the right thing to do, to stand in that basement and acknowledge what it held rather than treating the work I'd done in it as if it were a purely technical exercise. It wasn't. The building held something significant. Acknowledging that directly in the place that held it seemed like the minimum of what was owed. I did good work on that building. I think it should stand for another 100 years. I think about what occupies the basement, what it means to restore a building around a presence that predates any use the building will be put to going forward. I think the building needed to be restored, and I think what's in the basement needed to stay there in the building that holds its history, rather than being dispersed into the open air by demolition. Sometimes a building is the container for things that need a container, and I want to add something about what that idea has done to my practice over the 22 years since I first encountered it. I've worked on 300 buildings. Many of them have had the ambient quality of accumulated history, the specific weight of a place where many lives have been lived. A smaller number have had what I'd call significant content, the thing I felt in Floyd County. The thing I can't put in a report, but that I've learned to recognize over years of work. And working with those buildings has changed how I think about what preservation is and what it's for. The professional argument for preserving old buildings is usually architectural and historical. The craft of the construction, the significance of the history, the value of the material record. Those arguments are real and I make them. But I've come to think there's a third argument that the preservation field doesn't talk about because it doesn't have the language for it, which is that some old buildings are containers for things that need containing, and that demolishing them disperses what they hold into the environment in ways that may be more disruptive than preservation. I can't prove this. I can only tell you that in 22 years of working with old buildings, I've become more careful about demolition than engineering reasoning alone requires. That I advocate harder for preservation when the building has a quality I can feel even if I can't articulate it. Because I've come to believe that some of what those buildings hold needs to stay where it is in the structure, in the walls, in the specific place, and that the structure's function as container is as legitimate as its function as building. This is not a position I express in professional contexts for obvious reasons. I'm expressing it here in this account because it seems like the right context for it. Sometimes a building is the container for things that need a container. Sometimes the preservation of a structure is the preservation of something more than wood and stone. Story 9. My name is Loretta and I'm 74 and I'm from Marion, North Carolina, which is the county seat of McDowell County in the western part of the state. Let me tell you about Marion and about mill towns in that part of the mountains, because the account doesn't fully make sense without understanding what a mill community is. The textile mills that came into the Appalachians in the late 19th and early 20th centuries brought with them a specific social structure, the mill village, where the company owned the houses and the workers rented from the company, and the whole community revolved around the mill's schedule and the mill's requirements. Marion had that structure for generations, and it produced a specific kind of community, tight-knit and hierarchical, and with a particular relationship to work, where work wasn't separate from life, but was woven through everything, where the rhythm of the shifts was the rhythm of the family, in the neighborhood, in the town. I grew up inside that world, and I know it the way you know a world you grew up inside of, both its weight and its warmth. The mill in Marion had its own history that preceded my time there, including the massacre of 1929, which is part of the history of labor organizing in the Appalachian mill country, when striking workers were fired on outside the mill and 6 of them died. I didn't know that history when I was working there. I was young, and it was far in the past, and people didn't talk about it the way they talk about it now. But I've thought about it in relation to what I saw about the layers of labor and suffering and work that went into those floors over the decades, about how much weight a mill floor could absorb. Marion is a mill town, cotton mostly, and I grew up when the mill was still the center of everything, which is the county seat of McDowell County in the western part of the state. Marion is a mill town, cotton mostly, and the mill has had various owners and various fates over the decades, and the town has had various fates along with it, which is a story you know if you know mill towns in the Appalachians. I grew up when the mill was still the center of everything, when the neighborhood around the mill was where the mill workers lived, and the whole social life of that neighborhood revolved around the mill's schedule and the mill's families. And I grew up inside that world, and I know it from the inside. I want to tell you something that happened to me when I was 19 years old and that I've thought about ever since. I've never told it publicly because it's a strange thing to tell and I didn't want to be dismissed. But I'm 74 now and I've earned the right to say the strange things, and I heard someone on this channel tell their strange thing, and I decided that was the right place for mine. I was working the second shift at the mill, 3 to 11 in the summer. I want to describe what the weave room was actually like, because I think people who haven't been in a textile mill in that era don't have a real picture of it, and the picture matters for the account. The weave room was loud. This is understating it. The industrial looms of that era produced a noise level that made conversation impossible, except at very close range. That required you to communicate through gesture and mouthing and the kind of wordless coordination that develops between people who work in close proximity under the same constraints for years. The looms were large and close-packed, the floor space fully occupied, and moving through the room was moving through a grid of running machinery that you learn to navigate the way you learn the specific geography of any space you spend 8 hours a day in. The air was full of cotton lint, which settled in your hair and your clothes and your lungs, which is why mill workers of that generation had the specific respiratory problems they had. The light was bright, overhead fluorescent, and the combination of the noise and the light and the lint and the heat produced a specific sensory environment, unlike any other environment I know. You either belonged in it or you didn't, and after 6 months, I belonged in it. And the belonging is what made the wrongness of what I saw possible to recognize. Because you can only see something out of place in an environment you know deeply enough to know what belongs. I was working the second shift at the mill, 3 to 11 in the summer. The second shift was the shift the older workers generally avoided. The hot afternoon work in the weave room with the noise and the heat and the lint in the air. And the young workers who didn't have the seniority to avoid it worked it, including me. I'd been on second shift for about 6 months by that summer, and I knew the mill floor well, knew the machines and the rhythms of the work and the other workers on my shift, and I was comfortable there in the way that young people are comfortable in hard, repetitive work, when the work becomes habit. One evening in July, I came in for my shift, and the woman who worked the machine next to mine, a woman I'll call Mrs., Pruitt, who'd been at the mill for 30 years and was a second shift anchor, wasn't there. Not unusual people missed shifts. People had family situations. A different woman was on her machine. Someone I didn't know. And I didn't think much about it until I noticed, over the course of the first hour, that the woman on Mrs. Pruitt's machine was not someone I didn't know. She was someone I couldn't know. She was working the machine with the specific practiced efficiency of 30 years on that machine. The particular adjustments and compensations you develop over that much time with a specific piece of equipment. And she was wearing clothes from a different era, cotton house dress and work shoes, nothing unusual for an older woman, but not quite right for 1969, slightly off in the collar and the cut. I watched her work for an hour. She never looked up at me. She worked with the focus of someone deep in their shift, in the rhythm of the work, doing what she did. The noise in the weave room is extreme. The looms are loud enough that you communicate by gesture and lip reading. You don't have conversations. You can barely register anything outside your own immediate space, and whatever she was in that space, working, present in the work. I want to tell you what I did at the break, which was that I went to the shift supervisor and asked where Mrs. Pruitt was. He said she was sick, didn't expect her back for a week. I said, "Who put someone on her machine?" He said, "Nobody. He hadn't had a fill-in arranged yet." Why? Was her machine having problems? I said no. The machine was fine. I didn't tell him what I'd seen because I was 19 and I knew what 19-year-olds who report unusual things to supervisors hear back. After the break, I went back to the floor, and Mrs. Pruitt's machine was empty. Not running, not with someone on it, just standing idle, the way a machine stands when there's no operator. And the floor around it had the empty quality that floor space has when no one's working it. I worked the rest of my shift, and I went home, and I thought about what I'd seen, and I thought about it for the next week until Mrs. Pruitt came back, and when she came back, I watched her work for the first hour of her first shift, back to see if the movement matched what I'd seen. It did. The specific adjustments and compensations, the particular movements on that machine. They were hers, they matched exactly. And she'd been on that machine for 30 years, and the woman I'd seen working it had had the same 30 years in her hands. And the clothes were off, because Mrs. Pruitt was old enough that what she wore to work had been shaped in an earlier era. And she wore what was comfortable and what she'd always worn. And whoever I'd seen working that machine had come from the same era, the same practical working woman's wardrobe, the same unsentimental relationship with the work. I've thought about this for 55 years. I've thought about what it means that during the week Mrs. Pruitt was sick, someone or something worked her machine for the first hour of my shift, worked it with her specific 30-year expertise, and was gone by break. I've thought about whether the mill floor had, in some physical way, been shaped by 30 years of a woman's work on a specific machine, and whether that shaping could become active under certain conditions, whether a month of work, a year of work, a decade of work, could leave something that went beyond the groove in the wood floor under the machine. I've thought about whether what I saw was the past doing something, or whether it was something about Mrs. Pruitt herself, her presence on that floor being so established and so specific after 30 years that it continued to occupy the space even when she was absent. I don't have an answer. I know what I saw, and I know it was on that machine working with 30 years of practice in its hands. And I know it was gone by break, and that Mrs. Pruitt came back and the machine was hers again. I wanted to tell you what I did with what I'd seen in the months after, because the doing something is part of the account. I kept working at the mill for another decade after that July, long enough to know Mrs. Pruitt well, long enough to learn the weave room the way she knew it, long enough to feel the specific rhythm of a second shift summer. The heat and the lint and the machinery become something I knew without knowing I knew it. And during those years, I paid a different kind of attention, to the machines and the workers and the relationship between them, a slower and more patient attention. And what I saw was what Mrs. Pruitt had told me about on the bench, the lives being shaped by the work and the work being shaped by the lives, the machine and the worker developing their particular mutual relationship over years and years of the same shift in the same room. And I thought about what I'd seen that July week, the woman on Mrs. Pruitt's machine, working with 30 years of practice in her hands. I thought about it in terms of what the weave room actually was, which is a place where human beings had given extraordinary amounts of themselves, their time, their physical labor, their attention, their hearing and their lungs and their joints, in exchange for a wage and a community and a sense of competence and purpose. They'd given those things to the room and to the machines, the way you give things any place you inhabit fully. And the room had received what they gave and held it the way rooms hold what they receive. And on a July evening in 1969, when the woman who'd given 30 years to one particular machine wasn't there, the room had expressed what it held. I never told Mrs. Pruitt what I'd seen during the week she was sick. I came close once, years later, when we'd become friendly, the way you become friendly with people you worked beside for a long time. And I thought about it turning the words over, and I put them down. I wasn't sure how she'd receive it, and I wasn't sure what I'd be asking her to carry. But I want to tell you about a conversation we had, years into working together, that has stayed with me, and that I think is connected to what I saw, though it was not directly about it. Mrs. Pruitt and I were eating our lunch break together outside on a bench when the weather was good, which we did a few times a year. And she told me something about her relationship with the machine she'd worked for 30 years. She said she knew the machine. She said it in the way people say they know a road or they know a river, not metaphorically, but literally. As if the machine was an entity she'd developed a relationship with over time, and that the relationship had its own character, its own history, its own particular terms. She said the machine told her things. She said this without embarrassment, as a matter of fact, that over 30 years, the machine had taught her things about itself and about the work and about the quality of the cloth coming off it that she knew in her hands and her ears and her chest before she knew them in her head. She said sometimes she thought that relationship between her and the machine after 30 years was the most complete relationship she'd ever had with anything, and she said it without sadness, as an observation about the nature of long work. I thought about what I'd seen during the week she was sick. I thought about the machine working with her, 30 years in its hands. I thought about whether the machine had its own side of that relationship, whether 30 years of a woman's work could be absorbed into the mechanism and the frame and the sound of it running. I've never been sure what I saw, but I've been sure since that lunch break on that bench that the relationship Mrs. Pruitt described was real, and that when she was sick and absent, the machine missed her, in whatever sense machines can miss the people who've given them 30 years. The mill closure came in the way mill closures come in Appalachian towns, not all at once, but in stages. The workforce reduced and then reduced again. The machines idle for longer stretches. The shift schedule cut. The particular slow diminishment of a thing that was once the whole center of the community's working life. I watched it happen over the last decade I worked there, and I want to tell you what it was like, because the closure connects to the account. When a mill closes down that has been running for generations, when the looms go silent that have not been silent since they were installed, the silence has a specific quality. I don't mean this metaphorically. I mean the physical silence of a large building that has been full of industrial noise for 100 years and is suddenly not, and the disorientation that the workers feel moving through that silence. We'd spent years with the looms as the background of our whole working life, our ears calibrated to that specific frequency of machinery, our bodies adapted to the vibration in the floors, and the silence felt wrong the way a missing tooth feels wrong. the tongue probing the absence, because the presence was the baseline. I worked the last few months in that building in that silence, and I thought about everything the silence contained. Every shift that had run in those rooms, every worker who'd stood at a machine and learned the machine the way Mrs. Pruitt had learned hers. And I thought about what it meant for all of that to be over, for the looms to be cold and still, for the silence to be permanent. And I thought about the July week when someone or something had worked Mrs. Pruitt's machine for the first hour of my shift, with 30 years of practice in its hands. I thought about whether the silence would hold, that the way the activity had held it, whether the closed mill would be a different kind of a container for what it had received over a century of work. I hope it was. I hope the building held what the building had been given, all those years of labor and presence and the specific human skill of working a loom. And I hope that somewhere in the closed-down silence, it still runs, the way it ran that July, for the first hour of a shift, in the old rhythm, out of love for the work. The mill is closed now, has been for years, and the building's gone, converted, or demolished. I'm not sure which. The floor where that machine stood is gone. I think about Mrs. Pruitt sometimes, whether she's still alive, whether she ever knew that her machine worked without her the week she was sick. I don't think she'd have been surprised. She was a woman who knew that kind of work marks you down to the bone, and she'd have understood that 30 years on one machine leaves more of you there than you take away when you go. Story 10. I should tell you my background before I tell you the account, because the background changes how the account lands. I want to say something about Eastern Kentucky before I say anything else, because Eastern Kentucky is both misunderstood and exactly as described, depending on who's doing the describing and for what purpose. The coal towns and the poverty and the opioid crisis are real, and they're part of the story. And so is the extraordinary beauty of the country, and the depth of the communities, and the cultural richness of a place that produced more music and more literature per capita than most regions of the country. Both of those things are true, and I'm from the middle of all of it, which is the only position from which you can hold all of it at once. Johnson County sits on the Lavisa fork of the Big Sandy River, and the Lavisa drains the whole eastern side of the county as it comes down from the mountains of the Virginia border. The creeks that feed the Lavisa are the old roads, as I said, and the old roads are the old memory, and the old memory of Johnson County is very deep. This is one of the places in Appalachia where the settlement went in early and hard, and then became its own world for generations, where the families that came in became the county in a way that counties with more immigration and more turnover don't produce. 7 generations is not unusual in Eastern Kentucky. The family knowledge runs that deep, and the land knowledge runs that deep. And I think, from what I've come to understand about the seeing in the water, the other kind of knowledge runs that deep too. I should tell you my background before I tell you the account, because the background changes how the account lands. I grew up in Paintsville, Kentucky, in Johnson County, in the eastern part of the state. Johnson County is coal country, and always has been. And Paintsville is a town of about 4,000 people with a history that goes back to the early settlement of Kentucky, and a present that has been shaped, like so much of eastern Kentucky, by the rise and fall and partial rise and further complication of the coal industry. My family has been in Johnson County for 7 generations. I know where we're all buried. I know which ridge my family cleared and farmed before the timber companies came, and I know which mines my great-grandfather and his brothers went into, and I know which ones came out and which ones didn't. I went to college at a state school in Lexington, which was a significant journey from where I came from. And I came back to Johnson County after I graduated because it's where I'm from and where I belong. And I've been running a small business there for 15 years, and I intend to be there the rest of my life. I say this because I want you to know that I'm not someone who came to Appalachia from outside and developed a romantic relationship with its strangeness. I'm from here, The strangeness is ordinary to me, the way the mountains are ordinary to me. And what I'm going to tell you is ordinary to me in that sense, which is not the same as saying it doesn't matter. Ordinary things can matter deeply. I want to tell you about the water first, because the water is the beginning. Johnson County is drained by the Lavisa Fork of the Big Sandy River, and the creeks that feed the Lavisa come down off the ridges in every direction. And in the old settlement days, the creeks were the roads, the ways in and out of the hollows, the orienting lines of the geography. Every hollow has a name, and every name comes from a family or an incident or a feature. And the names are the county's memory. The way county names everywhere are the memory of the people who lived there and what they found and what they lost. I grew up knowing the creek names the way I knew family names, because in Johnson County, they're often the same. When I was about 35, I started having what I can only describe as moments on the water. Not visions, not supernatural events in the dramatic sense. Moments on the water, specific and brief. When the creek I was standing in or beside would show me something other than what was there. I fish a lot not as recreation, as a practice. The same way my father fished and his father before him, and I spent a lot of time in and around the creeks of Johnson County. And these moments started when I was in my mid-30s and have continued since. Let me tell you what fall fishing in that county is, first, so you understand what I was doing and in what state when the seeing started. October on Greasy Creek is cold and clear and specific, in the way that October in the eastern Kentucky mountains is specific. The maples and the tulip poplars have gone yellow and orange by early October, and the sourwood has gone to burgundy, and the light through all of that color onto the water has a quality that I don't know how to describe, except to say that it's entirely itself, not like any other light in any other season, warm and particulate, and it makes the world look like a painting of itself, without being painterly in any affected way. The water runs low and clear after the summer dries the watershed, and in the pools the bottom is visible. Every stone and every leaf and every fish visible, with a clarity that the spring freshets and the summer rain obscure for months. You can see what's in the pools in October in a way you can't the rest of the year. I've been fishing those creeks since I was old enough to hold a rod, and the October fishing is the kind of fishing you fish for the place as much as for the fish. You go out and the cold comes off the water and the light is in the leaves, and you stand in the current and the world reduces to the pool in front of you, and the way the water moves over the limestone ledges and the position of the fish in the current. Everything else goes away. That's what serious fishing does. It reduces the world to the immediate and the specific. And the immediate and the specific in those pools in October is as beautiful as anything I know. That's the state I was in when the pool on Greasy Creek first showed me something. Full presence, complete attention, the world reduced to the water. The first one I'll describe was the clearest. I was wading Greasy Creek, which is a tributary that comes off the ridge above the old family land. In late October, the water cold and low the way it gets in fall, I was working a particular pool that I've fished since I was a child, a deep pool under a limestone overhang where the water goes dark. And I was standing still the way you stand still when you're serious about fishing, patient and present, and the pool showed me something. I'm going to say that plainly because that's how it happened. The pool showed me something. The water was clear enough that in the right angle of light, you could see the bottom. And what I saw in the bottom of that pool was not the stream bed, it was a yard, a hard-packed dirt yard with a kitchen garden, beans and squash in rows, and the foundation line of a structure, small, a cabin or a shed, and at the edge of the yard a woman working, her back to me, doing something with her hands. The image was in the bottom of the pool the way a reflection is in the surface, but it wasn't a reflection because there was nothing above to reflect. It was in the bottom, and it lasted maybe 30 seconds, and then it was the stream bed again, the limestone and the sand, and the small fish holding in the current. I know that area. I know the family that had land up that hollow. I know when they settled it, and roughly when they left. What I saw in the bottom of that pool was consistent with the period when that land was actively farmed, which was the middle of the 19th century. I know this not because I have documentation of that specific yard or that specific garden, but because the details I saw, the varieties of the plants, the construction method of the foundation line, were consistent with that period and with that kind of settlement. I've had these moments perhaps 20 times over the past 15 years. I want to tell you about a few of the others besides Greasy Creek, because the variety of them tells you something about what the water keeps. There was a pool on Miller's Creek the summer my father turned 70, where I saw the pool from above, not from where I was standing at stream level, but from above, the way you'd see it from the ridge. And in that above view, I saw the shape of the old home site. The ridge cleared and the buildings arranged the way they'd be arranged in the mid-19th century. And I saw smoke from a chimney, thin smoke of morning fire, and two figures moving around the yard in the early light, brief 30 seconds or less, and then the pool from stream level, the limestone and the sand. There was a run of Laurel Creek, early spring high water, where the water was moving fast, and I was picking my way along the bank. And for maybe a minute, the bank I was walking looked different. The trees younger and farther back, and the bank itself a different shape, as if the creek and I were in the same moment, but the creek's moment was 100 years earlier. I walked along that older bank for a minute, keeping my footing carefully on roots and stones that were and weren't there. And then the bank was the bank I knew. And there was one moment that was different from the others, more intense, less passive. I was at a deep hole on Paintsville Lake's Inlet Creek, late October, low clear water. And I leaned over the bank to look into the pool, and the pool showed me a face. Not a historical face, not someone from the past. A face I recognized as belonging to the county, belonging to a family I knew, the face of a man who had died the previous spring in a work accident. He looked up at me from the bottom of the pool with an expression I couldn't read fully, and then he was gone. I drove to his family's house that afternoon. I don't know what I said. I know I went, and I know the mother was glad I came, and I think the coming was the point more than anything I said. I've thought about that pool and that face for years. It was different from the others, as I said, not historical, not from the past. A man who had died in the recent present, looking up at me from the bottom of the water. I've wondered if it was the water showing me what it received from his death, what his life and his labor in this county had given it, or whether it was something else. Whether it was him looking for the surface the way you look for the surface when you're in the water and need air. I don't know. What I know is that I went, and I know the mother held my hands for a long time when I came in, and I know I said his name to her, clearly, and that saying his name mattered. Maybe the point of being shown a face in the water is not to understand why you were shown it, but to do something about the showing. To go to the family, to say the name. I drove to his family's house that afternoon. I don't know what I said. I said I'd been thinking about him. His mother thanked me for coming. I've had these moments perhaps 20 times over the past 15 years, not always in the same location, not always on Greasy Creek, but always in the old water courses, always in still or slow water, always in fall when the water is low and clear. And they always show me the past. Not the dramatic past, not catastrophe or violence. The daily past. People working. A man splitting wood above a creek bank. Children. Laundry on a line beside a stream. The ordinary, unremarkable daily life of people who lived in this county before anyone currently living was born. The water showing me its memory of what it witnessed. I've talked to one person about this, an old woman in the county, who is the kind of person you go to in eastern Kentucky when you have something you need to understand. She listened and she said the water remembers. She said it not as a metaphor, as a statement of fact. And then she elaborated in the way that people elaborate when they've been waiting for a long time for the right person to ask. She said the old people of this county, had a specific understanding of the creeks that she'd been carrying since her grandmother gave it to her as a girl. She said the creeks were not separate from the memory of the people who'd lived beside them, that the water had been the center of life for so long. The drinking water and the washing water and the fishing water and the travel water and the boundary water. That the relationship between the people and the water had become mutual. That the people had shaped the water as much as the water had shaped the people. And that the water's memory was the people's memory, stored in a different medium. She said the seeing ran in families, as I've said, but she also said it required a specific quality of attention that not everyone in those families had. She said you couldn't force the seeing by wanting it, couldn't make the water show you anything by staring at it and willing it. She said the water showed the people it chose to show, and the people it chose were the ones who were present in a specific way, who came to the water with their whole attention, who treated the water as the living thing it was. She said the fishing was exactly right for it, that serious fishing, the kind of fishing where you're completely in the water and the light and the current and nothing else, was the same quality of attention the water responded to, that the fish and the water and the memory were all part of the same encounter. She said it not as a metaphor, as a statement of fact, the way you'd say the limestone holds water, or the ridge breaks the wind. She said the old people understood that the water in these mountains remembered what it had seen, and that certain people with the right connection to the land and the patience to be still, would see what the water remembered. She said it ran in families usually, that the seeing ran in families the same way the land ran in families. She asked who my people were, and I told her, and she nodded and said yes, it figures. I've thought about what it means to be a person to whom the water shows its memory. I've thought about the woman in the yard by Greasy Creek, about what her ordinary October day was, about whether she ever knew that 200 years later a man from the same county would be standing in the pool below her yard and watching her work from the bottom of the water. I've thought about what the water retains and why, and whether the retention is indiscriminate, whether it remembers everything equally, or whether it keeps what mattered. The lives that were lived with sufficient weight and presence to leave a mark in the cold, clear mountain water. I'm inclined toward the second. What I've seen in those pools is not random. It is specific. It is chosen, or if not chosen, then weighted toward the living that was done most fully, most presently, with the most complete attention to the particular place. I've told one other person in my family about the seeing, which is my son, who fishes with me, now the way I fished with my father. I told him when he was 17, which is probably the right age, old enough, to receive it as real information and young enough that it could settle into him before he formed his adult skepticism. I told him the same way the old woman in the county told me, which is matter-of-factly, this is a thing that happens in the family, and this is what the creeks do sometimes. This is the quality of attention that opens it. He listened with the quality of attention I described, the full presence attention. And when I finished, he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "Have you ever seen anyone I know?" And I said, "Not yet." He thought about that for a while. Then he said, "Do you think you'll see me someday?" And I was quiet for a while too, because it was a serious question and it deserved a serious answer. And then I said, "I hope so." I said, if I had any capacity at all to be in the water, I'd want to be in the October water on Greasy Creek, because it was the most beautiful water I knew. And I'd want to be seen by someone who was paying the right kind of attention. And if that person was him, I'd consider myself lucky. He nodded and we fished the rest of the afternoon, and we've never talked about it again, except as a kind of quiet, understood thing between us when we're in the water together. Both of us paying the right kind of attention. Both of us aware of what the water might be keeping. And I think about my own fishing. I think about the hours I've spent in those creeks, in the pools where the water remembers, standing still in the cold current, with my attention completely on the water and the fish and the light and nothing else. I think about whether the water is keeping me too, same way it kept the woman in the yard above Greasy Creek. Whether 200 years from now, some patient person standing in this same pool might see a man fishing, doing the thing his people have always done in this water, and whether that image will be ordinary and unremarkable, and precious the same way all the ordinary, unremarkable, precious things are. I hope so. I'd like to be in the water when I'm gone. And thinking about that leads me to what I actually believe about the seeing, which I should try to state plainly. I don't think the water keeps everything. I've been in pools and runs and riffles in this county for 40 years, and the vast majority of the time they're just water. Just the limestone and the sand and the fish, beautiful and sufficient in themselves. The seeing happens in a small fraction of the encounters, under specific conditions, and what it shows me is specific rather than random. I think the water keeps what was done in its presence with complete attention, not what was said or thought or felt in the abstract, not the ambient human presence that accumulates in a place from ordinary use, but the living that was done most fully and most presently beside it, and in it and through it. The lives that were lived with their whole attention turned toward the water, the way I turn my whole attention toward it when I fish. The Cherokee who used these creeks for 10,000 years before the settlement, and who gave them some of their names, their full attention to this water across 10,000 years, is in it, I believe. The farmers who took their water from it and their fish from it, and their living from it across the settlement generations, are in it. The people in between are in it, to the degree their attention was here, to the degree the specific water was part of how they were, in the world. And the fishermen, I believe the fishermen are in the water. The ones who stood in these pools with their full attention on the current and the light and the holding places of the fish, who were completely present in this water and nowhere else. I believe the water keeps them the way it keeps everything it's been given fully. And when I'm gone, I want to be kept that way. In the October water on Greasy Creek, at the pool where I first saw what the water remembered, in the cold and the clarity and the color of the leaves, that's where I've given my most complete attention across 40 years. That's where I'll be. I hope so. I'd like to be in the water when I'm gone. It seems like the right place to be remembered. And I want to say one last thing about what the seeing has given me over the 15 years it's been happening. Because I've described the seeing, and I've described what the old woman said about it. And I've described some of the specific instances. But I haven't said what it has done to how I live, which is the most important part. It has made me more present. That's the plainest way I can say it. Knowing that the water keeps what is done in its presence with full attention. Knowing that complete presence in a specific place leaves a mark that persists for generations has made me more committed to being fully in the places I am. Not as a spiritual practice in any formal sense, just as a practical matter. If the water keeps the lives that were fully lived beside it, then the way to be kept is to be fully there. To be in the creek in October with your whole attention on the current and the light and the fish. To be in Johnson County, in the county your people have inhabited for 7 generations, with the attention it deserves. To be in the life you have, in the specific place you have it, with nothing held back for some other time or some other place. The old people who gave this county its character, the ones in the water, the ones my old woman called fully present. They were fully present because that was the only option they had. They were in this place, and they were here entirely, and that entirety is what the water kept. I have more options than they had. I can be somewhere else. I can be distracted by somewhere else. I can be physically here and mentally everywhere. The seeing in the water is a lesson in what gets kept and what doesn't. And what gets kept is the being here entirely. So I try to be here entirely. I try to give the water what it kept from the people who were here before me. It seems like the right place to be remembered. That's the last submission tonight. Before you go, if this channel has become part of your routine, the single most useful thing you can do is subscribe and share one episode with someone who'd appreciate it. That's the whole of what keeps a channel this size going. And if you've got your own account from your own mountain town, your own place, with its own deep history and its own things that stay in the walls and the water, the addresses in the description, I read all of them. Thank you for being here. 10 accounts from 10 Appalachian mountain towns. And the thing I keep coming back to, sitting with all of them together, is how few of them are about fear. A woman standing on a church path in her old grief. Men working a shift that death didn't interrupt. A house that keeps its history in the walls and shows it to the right sleeper. A grandfather sitting in a chair because he said he would. The water in the mountain creeks holding what it witnessed and showing it to the right person at the right time. None of these are stories of threat. They're stories of persistence of lives and loves and work and grief and commitment, persisting past the expected end, holding on in the places they belong, still being what they were. Take care of yourselves. Take care of your places. This has been Park Ranger Files.